Chapter 31. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 7, Human, American. Darkness, true darkness. I'm surrounded by total and complete darkness, not the kind you see when you're in a dark room or when you close your eyes. No, this is like someone painted my eyes with the blackest of paints and buried me deep underground. It's stifling, pressing in around me. It's unnerving, but there's something even worse. The darkness is matched by silence. I've never heard nothingness before. I can't even hear my heartbeat. I can't feel my heartbeat. What is this? What's happening? Silly boy, you used up all your magic. Whatever are we going to do with you? 10? No, I know that voice that isn't a voice, clawing at the back of my mind, begging me to remember. It's feminine, a woman. Mum? No, younger, much younger. Where am I? The darkness suddenly fled, and I found myself standing within a void of white. The silence remained. I check to make sure I'm intact by patting my body as I glance around for whoever's here with me. I've got all my parts, but they're not covered by anything. I looked down and confirmed my nudity, but something's off. I should have wounds, but I'm not hurt anymore. I was bleeding. What happened? The hole in my hand is healed and didn't even leave a scar. Wait, all of my scars are gone. What the hell? Did I die? Of course not. You don't die from using up all your magic, you silly little mudman. Cass laughed. You're also not healed. You look how you should look, without the random graffiti that life tends to add. I quickly spun around. Standing in glorious nudity before me was Cassandra, the love of my life. Except it isn't. It's something else entirely. I knew this instinctively, but it took my brain a moment to catch up. Cass wouldn't know about magic, and I don't recall her ever using silly little mudman as a term of endearment. The closer I looked, the more obvious it was that the thing standing in front of me wasn't Cass. Her hair's the wrong shade of blonde, her eyes are the wrong shade of blue, and she's shorter than she should be. You're not Cass, I managed to say, my breath fighting to stay in my lungs as if it didn't want to leave me. You see me as your girlfriend. What do... I ran out of breath. I panicked for a moment, but then realized I was fine. I couldn't breathe, but I also couldn't suffocate. Maybe I can just think. What do you mean? I mentally asked. Well, I'm not exactly appearing to you in a physical form. You're not exactly in a physical form either, for that matter. Your mind is struggling to interpret these things with visual. It smiled with Cass's mouth and audio stimuli. Are we in my mind? No, but your mind and soul are intrinsically linked. One cannot maintain its form without the other. Then where are we? That, the thing moved closer and fluttered Cass' eyelashes at me, isn't relevant. I don't understand. I took a step back. That's obvious, and I'm afraid that your comprehension of our location isn't at all important. I was going to approach you as you slept tonight, but since the opportunity presented itself sooner... Approach me? I interrupted. Why? Because you're amusing. Not just to me, but to many others as well. Unfortunately for said amusement, you're unlikely to know what to do when you get to your next destination. You'll get there, seek out a scholar, get your little words translated, and end up right back to square one. It rolled her eyes at me. It would take you years to figure out the next step, and you don't have that long. Why not? Because some very stupid mer are getting ready to do some very stupid things, and that will result in your leads drying up. I stare at the thing in front of me, trying to work out what it's talking about. It's starting to look less and less like Cass. Her eyes are now purple, and her hair was now grey, nearly white. But everything else remained the same. How do you know all this? I know almost everything that happens in the mortal realm, sweetie, it said with a smile. I know that you're a human. I know that Nash pulled you out of a dungeon. I know how you felt when you woke up, and above all that I know what you hope to accomplish. It will be an absolute delight to see if you can do it or not. What are you, some sort of god? Well, it sighed almost comically. I suppose I have been called that, but unlike the gods you're familiar with, I had absolutely nothing to do with creating anything. Neither did any of the other beings known as gods for that matter. Then why are you known as gods? Mortals love to name and classify things. They do their best to make everything fit into tiny little boxes, especially when they don't know enough about something to even begin to hope to properly classify it. Those with immense power that exist beyond their reckoning are stuffed neatly into the box labeled God. So this thing isn't a god, but is close enough to be called one. It's wearing Cassandra's face, but it claims it's not doing so intentionally. It can read my thoughts too, even when I'm not trying to verbalize them, but we're not in my mind. Doesn't really make much sense, does it? It laughed. If it helps you get over it, you can call this place limbo or purgatory. You're more familiar with such concepts, and the only real difference is that this isn't a waiting area for the dead. I see. Well, what do you call this place? I don't. Things like me don't have any reason to name things. Among ourselves, we're simply able to broadcast a thought with complete context. If I want a specific person to meet me in a specific place, all I have to do is think about the details. However, none of this is relevant, Nick. Okay, so we're in limbo, but not really. And you're a god, but not really. So what do you want with me? There we go. It raised an index finger and tapped my nose. Finally, we can get to business. You're going to Bolser. When you get there, Ulak will want to visit some scholars to get the text you found in the dungeon translated. His childish thirst for knowledge will cause him to decline an invitation to see the dragon. Do not let him decline that invitation. It's hard to imagine Ulak turning down the chance to see a dragon. To him, it's just a sleeping dragon. It will be there once your task is complete. Whether he sees it now or 5 years from now doesn't really matter to him. The puzzle of what you are and where you came from is a much more pressing matter to the cutest little orc scholar. I found myself taken aback by that description of Ulak, but managed to press on. What do we do after seeing the dragon? The choices afterwards will be clear, and you'll know which one to make to continue your trek back to Cass. If you need another nudge at some point, I'll pop by. Why are you helping me? Just because I'm amusing? Don't underestimate the value of amusement to a being like me. But the actual reason is that I'm rooting for you. It smiled, but its mouth had changed. It wasn't Cassandra's anymore. The lips were fuller and the teeth were far more pointed. It would break my heart, metaphorically speaking, to see you fail your great quest. If it weren't for my pact, I'd tell you exactly how to get to where you need to get to. It gestured with one of its arms, and the sound of chains clinked from somewhere. I blinked in surprise and suddenly saw the source of the noise. She was covered in chains, and the links were made of solid crimson light. They sent sparks flying at even the slightest movement. I looked for what they were attached to, but the chains began and ended inside the being before me. I could only imagine that they were attached directly to its bones. How didn't I see these before? Your perception is limited, Nick. There's a lot that you can't see, hear, smell, or feel. Perception is a funny thing, though. Once someone points something out to you, suddenly you see it all over the place. It grinned. Its appearance had changed. It no longer looked like Cass at all. Its hair was radiant blue, its eyes were deep purple, and its skin had a mirror-like quality to it. It was still nude, but its proportions had changed. It was now taller than me and was shaped more like Nima than Cass, including the odd alligator teeth that all orcs have. Somehow this set me at ease a bit. Should I tell the others about you? Ulak and Nash will believe you, so you can tell them if you think it will make things easier. If you tell others, they will understandably believe that you're not well in the head. This will add obstacles to your path that will require bloodshed to clear. It shrugged. Up to you, though. Bloodshed? Oh yes. It grinned again. Instead of gently pushing past the obstacles standing in your way, they'll force you to gut them and unleash rivers of blood that will flood along your path. Since violence begets more violence, more blood will inevitably flow. On the bright side, letting the violence guide you will get you to your goals much faster. The thing's smile erased any sort of ease I had felt up to that point. The smile spoke volumes, hinting at a macabre enjoyment of all things hateful and violent. I involuntarily took a step backward. I'd rather not, it interrupted with a sigh. I know, Nick, I know, and that's fine. It's only one way to get you where you're going. It's the most fun way, in my opinion, but I'm fully capable of understanding that you would find it a lot less fun than I would. It shrank a little bit, as if deflating. like someone had just told it that the next installment of its favorite slasher movie would be PG-13. Then it laughed a bit and came back up to full size. "You have more questions and we've got time. I'll answer what I can, though the answers will likely be disappointing," it said. What happened to me? How did I end up in this world? I don't actually know. You were outside of our perception until Nash lifted you from that altar. Is Cass okay? I don't know. She's outside of my perception. Damn, I crossed my arms to think for a moment. Why are you the one who is approaching me? I like to play with mortals, and so I'm far more familiar with doing so than others of my kind. Plus, I really wanted to. It smiled. I threatened to throw a temper tantrum if I wasn't picked. This threw me off. A being that people called God, throwing a temper tantrum, like a toddler. Then I remembered some of the Greek gods and felt kind of foolish. The thing smiled at me knowingly. I sighed and thought about what my next question should be. Will I make it back to Cass's? I don't know, but we can't wait to find out. You don't know? Of course not. I have a general idea of how things might go if all the mortals involved make certain choices at certain times, but I don't actually know the end result until it happens. Well, all right then. Do I have a chance to make it back to Cass? The thing laughed and held up the chains, indicating that it couldn't answer. I felt a surge of anger rush through me, but quickly quelled it. The anger isn't exactly justified. The fact that we're even having this conversation means that it's at least somewhat willing to help. If anything, I should be grateful. What can I do to increase my chances of seeing Cass again? Train every chance you get. Learn new spells. Put your body through hell. The stronger you get, the better your odds are. It smiled again. You have a lot of potential. If you start focusing on your endurance, you'll find that you can increase your strength faster than most can. Even if you fail to get back home, you'll be able to live comfortably amongst the mortals of this world. I was about to express my distaste at this possibility, but the thing held up a hand. It's time for you to wake up. Go see the dragon. Everything went dark again. Chapter 32. Nash Alta, Adventurer Level 9, Orc, Newfound. The exploding cart caught me by surprise. Thankfully, I had quick recovery active because of the bandits. A new skill I picked up while training with Nick, and it does exactly as advertised. I was the first one up, my ears ringing and head swimming. I shook the cobwebs out of my skull and checked myself over to make sure I was in one piece. Lucky, no shrapnel wounds. As I grabbed my swords up off the ground and sheathed them, I looked around. Everyone else was on the ground. Ulak was just behind where I'd landed, and I ran over to him first. "Ulak!" I shouted as I shook him. "Wake up, brother. Tell me you're okay." He didn't stir. Shit. I tried to get his robe off so I could check him for injuries. I wasn't able to get it off, but I was able to get it open. He was wearing a tunic with shorts underneath, blood on his legs. I ripped his tunic apart to see if his chest was fine, no blood, and it was rising and falling to indicate he was breathing. I tore a strip off his tunic and bandaged the small wound on his leg. I glanced up and saw Imlaw trying and failing to help Nick stand. As I straightened up to go check on him, I heard someone behind me groaning. Instinctively, I drew my swords. My axe, being as cumbersome as it is, had been left in the cart. I spun and barely managed to block the first bandit's strike as the second bandit was standing up. I'd heard the second bandit, which had ruined the first's sneak attack. The other 5 were in no condition to fight. The second bandit took a moment to get his bearings as I took a slash at the first one, which he dodged. He wasn't able to dodge the follow-up kick, though. He hit the ground and rolled backward, and I followed and slashed with both swords. The bandit dodged backward again, which is fine by me. I want to distance him from Ulak. The other bandit saw our conflict and lunged at me with his spear. I parried it and blocked another strike from the first bandit. "Ulak!" Nick shouted from behind me. "Ulak's out cold," I replied, swinging at the first orc again. I hope he's just out cold. A coma would be terrible this far from town. I parried the spear again and rushed the bandit with the sword. He managed to block the strike to his throat, but wasn't able to avoid the slash across his gut. It went deep, and he fell to the ground holding his injury. I shut out his cries of pain as I turned my attention to the one with the spear. There's no need to worry about him getting back up. I know a fatal blow when I see it. The bandit with the spear also knew a fatal blow by sight and became more cautious. I darted forward, and he leapt back while jabbing at me with the spear. If he were any more skilled with his spear, I'd be in trouble. However, after the fourth time of him jumping back and trying to poke me, I was starting to get annoyed. "Go to the hells, you bastard!" the bandit growled at me. "Lead the way," I replied, slashing the tip off of his spear. The bandit looked at his spear dumbfounded, and I took advantage of this to use another skill I'd unlocked. I activated thrusting throw, and my sword leapt from my hand and plunged itself into the bandit's chest. His gaze moved from his spear to the hilt that was now attached to his chest, and then to me as he crumpled under the weight of death. This particular skill had come to me after constantly throwing Nick's training weapon back to him. I don't think he even realized that I'd activated the skill. He probably believes I'm just good at throwing training swords directly at his heart. I walked over to the bandit and pulled my sword from its fleshy sheath. I took this opportunity to examine the remains of the explosion and the other 5 bandits, which was a mistake. Even with all the death and destruction I'd seen before, the way their bodies were torn apart and contorted beyond recognition made my stomach churn. I turned away and closed my eyes, trying to think of anything else so that it wouldn't stick with me. Food's a bad thought. No, let's think about relaxing at the training field, staring up at the sky, watching the clouds go by. Nima by my side, giggling at something I said. Not even a joke, but she found it funny regardless. A good memory to blot out the bad. "Help!" an unfamiliar voice called out from behind me. I turned to look and saw the dwarf we'd ran past earlier, now kneeling over Nick. Imlaw was also on the ground. I wiped my swords on Spear Bandit's pants and kicked Ulak's shoe as I passed, but he didn't even stir. Gods, he's out for the count. I hope he's all right. "What's going on?" I asked the dwarf as I approached. The gnome was hit and bleeding out, and human. Human? What? He's a human. That doesn't matter, though. Focus up. What happened? Oh, I guess he figured out how to use healing magic. He used it on the gnome and then passed out. He's wounded pretty bad. Looks like he was hit by a bunch of shrapnel, the dwarf explained. I knelt and checked the boy's wounds, and the dwarf was right. He had a hole clean through his right hand, another hole in his shoulder, 2 in his left leg, and 1 in his right leg. I couldn't find any holes in his cuirass, though. I breathed a sigh of relief. "He'll be fine," I said. "How can you say that? If he lost enough blood to pass out, then he definitely won't be fine. We got to do something. Look at the ground. There isn't nearly enough blood here to cause someone his size to pass out," I explained. "Plus, our healer is down for the count. Ain't a damn thing we could do even if we wanted to." "We could bandage his wounds at least," the dwarf muttered. "Nope, with Nick, that's a bad idea. I'll show you why," I grinned. "Hey, Ten, you there?" "Yes," Ten said with Nick's voice. The dwarf leapt back from the boy with startling speed. He didn't get far before he stumbled and landed on his arse, staring at Nick with an open-mouthed frown. Nick, however, didn't move at all. After a moment, the dwarf turned to look at me again. "Ten is a robot that lives in Nick's head and helps heal him," I explained. "I'm not a robot," Ten said. "Close enough. Anyway, he's got foreign objects in some of his wounds, doesn't he?" I asked. "Yes." "And it would be a bad idea to bandage those wounds while you try to heal them, right?" "Correct. If you bandage the wounds, it would prevent me from removing the shrapnel. I would have to heal around it, and I would then have to force the shrapnel out of the body through the skin, which would take an annoyingly long time without surgical assistance." "There you have it," I said to the dwarf. "All we can do is wait for our injured to wake up. Nick healed Imlaw, Ten's healing Nick, and Ulak doesn't have any visible injuries. He's probably got one hell of a concussion, though." I see," the dwarf said, starting to shake off the shock. "Anyways, I'm Nash. What's your name?" "Oh, I'm Renv. Renv Marfix. Pleasure to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." "Yeah, me too," I chuckled darkly. "So what were you doing out here, Renv?" My uncle owns one of the biggest suppliers in Bolser, and I was transporting mining equipment to Kirkina for him. Shovels, picks, buckets, and some bang clay. Recipe C, he explained. The bandits weren't interested in the gear, but were convinced they could get a good ransom out of me. Well, that explains the explosion. But that sounds like pretty valuable cargo. Why didn't you have guards? I asked. I did. 3 of them. The bandits killed them and tossed their bodies in the cart. His expression went dark. They were friends of mine. We grew up together, but they became adventurers, and I became a businessman. Now they're dead. Sorry for your loss, I said gently. I know how hard that is. I've lost some friends, Reese. And Nick suddenly sat up as if he were in the middle of a fight and then winced at the pain his various injuries caused. He looked around in an odd way, as if glad his eyes were working. He looked at Renv, then at me, and then closed his eyes and took a deep breath. You all right? I asked. Yeah, I'll be okay. He looked at Renv again. Never mind, I'm fine, just used all my magic. How's Imlaw? He's out, but looks all right. Yulk's out too. He's not up yet? Wait, how long was I out? Just a few minutes, Renv said. I'm Renv, by the way, didn't get a chance to make introductions with all the excitement. I'm Nick, the boy replied. Nice to meet you. They discussed how we had got to be where we are, but I was distracted by Yulk. He'd been out for a while. He'd probably taken a knock on the head, but I hadn't seen any blood. I wondered about trying to load Yulk and Imlaw into the cart, but the Hanases looked angsty. The explosion had probably put them on edge, and a kick from one of them would be bad no matter who it connected with. Nick, has your magic recharged at all? I asked. Let me check. He closed his eyes and concentrated for a moment. Yes, I've got about a quarter of it back. I want you to heal Yulk. Can you move? Not on my own. Ten says my leg's fractured. All right. Nick looked up at me questioningly as I stood and brushed the dirt off of my knee. I grinned as I leaned down, placed my arms beneath his armpits, and lifted him from the ground. He protested a bit as I carried him over to Yulk's still unconscious form, and winced as I set him down. Heal him, I said. What's wrong with him? Nick asked. I don't know. Probably took a knock to the head, just cast the spell and let it figure it out. I'm pretty sure that's not how it works. I'm pretty sure it is. You think healers have time to figure out what's wrong with a person before they heal them? I asked angrily. But, fine, he relented. Lay her on him. Tsak. A faint light glowed around Nick's hand as the spell went to work on Yulk. I crossed my arms in satisfaction, but raised an eyebrow as I noticed the light didn't fade like it normally would. The spell was still going. Whenever Yulk or other healers cast a healing spell, the light would only last for about a second. Before I could say anything, Yulk's eyes shot open and he sat up. Nick let his arm drop to his side as Yulk looked around, trying to figure out what was going on. Finally, my brother looked at us and tilted his head questioningly. You got knocked out by an explosion from the flaming cart, I explained. Then I healed you, Nick added with a grin. You healed me? Yulk asked with a shocked expression. Well, congratulations on unlocking your first healing spell. Which was it? Minor heal, Nick said. Good. That's the first level of healing, Yulk nodded, rubbing the back of his head as if it were sore. Nice place to start from. Is everyone okay? I'm fine. Nick's got some new holes and Imlaw's unconscious, I explained. The dwarf that we rescued, Renv, is also uninjured. I see. Where'd the flaming cart go? Already told you. That's what blew up. It had bang clay in it. Right, that makes sense, Yulk said as he carefully stood up. Shall we go check on Imlaw then? I can't walk. I've got a fracture in my leg, Nick explained. Not a problem, I said with a grin as I picked him up again. Yulk and I walked over to Imlaw as my new baggage protested again. The protests got a little more colourful this time, so I was less gentle when I set him down. Nick glared at me angrily as Yulk knelt to check on the gnome. Will he be okay? Renv asked. Yulk expressed as he rubbed his chin thoughtfully. What happened to him? A piece of shrapnel went through his gut, but he didn't notice it at first. He passed out as he was checking on me, Nick explained. Thankfully, it went clean through, so I cast minor heal on him, but he didn't wake up. Then I ended up passing out from using all my magic. Ulak looked at Nick with a confused expression. "What else did you use your magic on?" he asked. "Nothing," Nick answered. "But you have a ton of magic. Minor heal wouldn't even come close to using all of it," Ulak said. "I used the spell until I ran out of magic," Nick explained. "How many times did you cast it?" As Ulak asked that, I made a connection between what Nick was saying, what Ulak was asking, and the strange length of time I'd seen from Nick's healing spell. I couldn't help but laugh, which made everyone look at me. "When he cast Minor Heal, it seemed to last longer than when you cast it," I explained. "I think he's able to continue the spell with just one cast." "Is that so?" Ulak turned back to Nick. "I wonder what sort of effect that has on the healing." "I don't know much about magic," Renv interrupted, "but is the gnome going to be okay? He's been out for a while." Right. He must have lost a bit of blood, but I can wake him up," Ulak nodded. Ulak then slapped Imlaw across the face, the sound of which stunned the rest of us into silence. It seemed to echo around us. Nick opened his mouth, but Imlaw mumbled something, and his eyes fluttered open. He looked at each of us and sat up, holding the side of his face. "What happened?" he asked. "Come on, get up." Ulak smiled down at the gnome. "It's time to get back on the road." Chapter 33. Ulak Alta, Adventurer Level 7, Orc Nulavan. Many things were running through my mind as we continued our journey. The fragile sturdiness of life, the luck we've had in our most recent exploits, curiosity regarding Renv, and above all else Nick's ability to continuously cast Minor Heal. Did casting it continuously have any benefit over casting it as a one-off? Can everyone cast it continuously, or just Nick? He had seemed confused while we were discussing it, as if he was surprised by our surprise. Is it just the basic nature of the spell to cast it continuously? If so, how did we not discover this sooner? I'd been taught my healing spells by a specialist, who had studied under other specialists, who had learned the concepts behind healing magic from ancient tomes. As far as I know, that's how every healer actually learns healing magic. Technically, you should be able to learn the spells on your own with a good deal of knowledge about anatomy and physiology, but I'm unaware of anyone who has. This is likely due to the fact that trying to learn anatomy and physiology on your own is difficult to do legally, and most who attempt to do it illegally end up facing rather dire consequences. Well deserved, to be sure, but the end result is that they're not in a position to pass on any secrets they garner. I'd previously told Nick that he might be able to cast healing just to see if he could. He seemed to have quite a bit of knowledge, so it wasn't a stretch to imagine he knew a thing or two about how a body functions. If he hadn't, I would have taken him to a specialist when our travels were somewhat less urgent. Nick has saved us a trip, but simultaneously opened a can of crawlers without a single fishing line in sight. "And that's how I learned the spell," Nick explained to a shocked audience. Even Nash's mouth was agape, despite his attempts to remain stoic. The dwarf had asked plenty of questions, demonstrating an unfamiliarity with magic. Imlaw looked paler and paler as the story had gone on, likely due to it describing his near demise. Imlaw's a clever one. He'd quite easily put together the fact that if Nick hadn't been with us, he'd have died. Even if he had ignored Renv's urgent situation with the bandits and continued on, his cart would have been right next to the explosion when it had occurred. That kind of proximity wouldn't have allowed for survival, even if he'd managed to avoid shrapnel. "Well, it's no wonder you lost consciousness," I said with a smile. "You burned through all your reserves, and you were injured on top of that. It would have been odd if you hadn't passed out. Not quite as odd as continuously casting Minor Heal, though." "Why's that odd?" Nick asked. "Because it's like Wind Spear," I answered. "It has a singular effect. Or at least that's what I was led to believe. I don't even know what the benefit of holding the spell actually could be." "Well," Nash interjected, "Imlaw had a through and through. One Minor Heal would have stopped the bleeding and maybe stabilized him, but it would have taken a bunch of castings to close the wound entirely, right?" I turned to look at my brother, who had once again found the stone I'd been blindly stumbling over, and gave him a silent nod. I had dismissed anything odd about Imlaw's wound due to the powerful nature of Nick's casting abilities. My mind had simply written it off as another instance of one of his spells being more powerful than it should be. Stupid of me, to be sure. Unlike some spells, healing spells don't get more potent the more magic you put into them. They have a set cost and a set result, which is why there are different types. Minor heal can stabilize someone that is mortally wounded for a time. Lesser heal will repair internal injury and regenerate lost blood. Major heal can repair gratuitous injury and broken bones, and greater heal can regenerate lost limbs. Each spell grants a brief amount of regeneration and can also do what the previous levels can, but cost exponentially more magic to cast. As Nash pointed out, these spells have a compounding effect, meaning that depending on the wound, casting minor heal 3 times can be more efficient than casting lesser heal once. But Nick had only cast minor heal the 1 time, so it shouldn't have been possible to completely heal Imlaw. Therefore, the benefit to continuous casting minor heal is that it has a similar effect to casting it multiple times. A blood-drenched piece of wood clattered to the floor of the cart, originating from one of Nick's wounds. This wasn't the first time it had happened, and Nick, having become used to this by now, casually picked it up and tossed it over the side of the cart. Suddenly, a thought occurred to me. "Nick, was that the last piece of shrapnel?" I asked. Nick took a moment to consult Ten and then nodded. "I'd like to do an experiment," I smiled. "Ask Ten if it's okay for me to cast a healing spell on you." "Ten says that would be okay," Nick said after another moment. "Good," I said. "Leia Ronim Tsak." I tried to hold the spell and was surprised when it actually worked. We watched the wound on Nick's hand close with a mixture of shock and glee. The glee was mostly from me. However, I also noticed that the spell was very quickly draining my magic reserve. I stopped the spell before I ran out of magic, but it was a rather close call. I wouldn't want to be passing out like Nick had. "Well, that answers several questions," I said, managing to stifle my excitement. "First, you can continue the regenerative effect of minor heal by continuously casting it. Second, it costs magic for every second that you maintain the spell. Overall, it's more efficient than casting the spell multiple times. We'll need to have the official literature updated." "For every second?" Nash asked. "Is it better than, lesser heal?" "Not quite. I suspect that if lesser heal can also be continuously cast, the regenerative effect would be much more efficient," I answered. "I'd love to do more experimentation, but it will have to wait." "I know some pretty advanced healers," Renv added. "If you'd like, I can bring this to their attention and make sure they credit you and Nick with the discovery. They would happily perform the experimentation that you want done." Nash gave me a knowing look, but I held up a hand to keep him from speaking for me. He knows how much I love scientific inquiry, and having others perform experiments in my stead would typically be a worst-case scenario for me. However, normally I would rather do the experiments myself, but since we're speaking of magic that can save lives, I will gratefully accept your assistance, I replied. "Really?" Nash asked. "Yes, we don't know if we will find any answers in Bolser, and we've given our oath to aid Nick in finding his way home," I said. "It would be difficult to travel and research these phenomena simultaneously, at least while observing any semblance of scientific rigor. Since this may save lives, time is of the essence. Therefore, it only makes sense to have someone else begin research immediately." "That's pretty mature of you," Nash said with a proud smirk. "But if we do find answers in Bolser and wrap things up quickly, I can always join in on the research," I quickly added. "Scientific competition is healthy after all." "Yeah, that sounds more like you." We all had a good laugh, and when we were finished, Renv looked contemplative. "You said you swore to help Nick find his way home." "I already gathered that he's not from around here, but how far away are we talking?" he asked. "I'm right here, you know," Nick chuckled. "Oh, right. Apologies. Then I redirect my questions to you, good sir." Renv bowed his head apologetically. "That's all right," Nick said. "I'm from a different world, and there's no way to know how distant that world is. I'm kind of assuming that it's an alternate reality kind of thing, but I guess it's possible that I was abducted from my world by aliens and brought here for some reason." Nick noted that we were all staring at him incredulously. "Well, it's a thought," he said quietly. "Someone from a different country might have abducted you and brought you here?" Renv asked. "No, not that kind of alien," Nick quickly explained. "Like a different species that has the ability to travel through space." "Space?" Nash asked. "Yeah, you know, above the sky." Nick asked in return. If you go up high enough, you end up in space. He's right, I confirmed. Not much is known about space, so I suppose it's possible. Magic is definitely the more likely possibility, though. Why's that? Nick asked. Because space is very, very big. The sheer distances involved would require magical traversal, I explained. So even if you were abducted by space aliens, magic is probably what brought you here. I don't know, he said. My people were to the point of limited space travel, and some were even living in space stations. We were about to get to the point of consumer space travel, so there's been plenty of scientific theories among my people regarding how to travel space faster. It's possible someone beat us to it. We all stared at him once again, this time with our mouths agape. There were so many questions running through my mind all at once. What was space like? How did his people get up to space in the first place? What did they find? Why the hell hadn't he mentioned that before? He noticed our slack jaws. I haven't been to space myself, he explained. There isn't any air up there, so you've got to wear a special airtight suit with tanks of air that feed into it. It also costs a lot of money to build the vehicles necessary to get there, so they only sent the best and brightest at first. As more experiments and flights were performed, rich merchants started going to space themselves. As far as I know, they were only able to just barely make it to space. There isn't any air in space? Nash asked. That makes sense, actually, I said. The higher you go up a mountain, the less air there is. I'm assuming that the space carts were launched from the tops of mountains. We call them spaceships, and I don't think so. I know that they launch a bunch from a place called Cape Canaveral, which I'm pretty sure is close to sea level, Nick said. I don't think it makes much of a difference. Space is really far up, even compared to the tallest of mountains. What did your people find in space? Renv asked. Well, it's like Ulak said. Everything is really, really far apart. In between the planets and stuff, there's a whole lot of nothing too. So there wasn't a lot of interest in exploring space outside of specific scientific communities. I do remember seeing some news about plans to mine some asteroids, but I don't know what became of that. What about on the planets? Imlaw asked. Well, we landed remote control robots on some of them to explore and see if we could find life. But as far as I know, we didn't find much. People were getting excited about finding water on one of the planets, but other than that, they're pretty barren. I don't think any of them have breathable air either. Nick shrugged. Wait, you said that humans don't have magic, Nash said. How did you make ships that made it that far into the sky? I watched Renv's expression as Nick explained humanity's method of travel via explosive propulsion. I had been shocked to learn of it, but the dwarf was absolutely flabbergasted. It was hard to see Imlaw's expression, but he was obviously paying close attention to what Nick was saying. I chuckled slightly, enjoying the novelty of the conversation. So even without magic, your people can fly like birds? Renv asked. Not really, Nick said. We've got a bunch of different kinds of aircraft, but I'm pretty sure all of them move much faster than birds do. Plus, most planes carry a bunch of people at once. It's the fastest way to go from one continent to another. That's amazing, the dwarf replied. I had to agree. The more I learned about humans, the more I wanted to know. I desperately wanted to compare our development to their own, but I doubt that Nick would have that kind of information at his age. Plus, there are certain aspects of human history that he is obviously uncomfortable sharing. I could imagine why. Everyone has darkness in their pasts they'd like to forget. If kingdoms form on a bed of flowers, it's because those flowers were fed with blood. There's something up ahead, Imlaw called out. What is it? I stood to get a better look. It looks like, the gnome paused, a checkpoint. Chapter 34. Adventurer level, not applicable. This is boring, my friend complained. Most things are, I replied. We've got nothing better to do, though. Yeah, but I thought this road was supposed to be busy. There hasn't been anyone all day. Your whining will do nothing to change that. As the words left my mouth, the sound of hooves and wooden wheels in the distance filled my ears. They were still fairly far away, but my friend's face twisted into a smug expression. I sighed, straightened my Bolser guard uniform, and sat in the place that I was supposed to be sitting. My friend leaned on the barricade, their feminine curves fighting desperately against the uniform. Their positioning was obviously intended to bring notice to the aforementioned curves. That doesn't mean anything, it's just a coincidence. Oh, please, you know better than that, they grinned. No, I don't, I said sarcastically. I don't know anything. I am empty of all forms of knowledge. My friend giggled as the travellers came into view. 2 carts pulled by 2 hnasses carrying quite the interesting bunch. A pair of orcs, a gnome, a dwarf, and something else. Almost like an elf, but with an extremely murky aura. Power, danger, cunning, hunger, sorrow, ambition, and so many other things swirled around this creature. Things were further complicated by the positive emissions, which were just as intense. Innocence, love, kindness, compassion, happiness, and so on. It's not exactly uncommon to feel all these things at once from someone, but the intensity was an entirely different matter. It spoke of a remarkable capacity for cruelty and heroism, a living contradiction. I glanced over to my friend, who was just as terrified as I was by this thing. It reminded me of the tales that were told to freshborn to keep them from running off on their own. Horrible monsters that wielded rough iron and could destroy anything, lurking in the darkest corners, waiting to pounce. I desperately didn't want to interact with this thing, but there might not be another chance like this. We simply do not have any other choice. I shrugged off my abject terror, took a deep breath, and stood. I picked up my pencil and book, completing my act. "What's this?" the gnome asked. "Taxes were thin last fiscal year, so this is a toll road now," my friend said. "To pass, I'll need to take your names," I added, gesturing with the open book. "We will then determine if you must pay the toll." There was a long pause from the group that made my skin crawl. It's not good for us when they start to think about things. I took a long look at them and noticed weapons and signs of fighting. Oh no, they might be adventurers. They're not about to attack us, are they? I gulped down my fear and stood firm. The dwarf was whispering to the bald orc, and the bald orc was whispering back. I could hear what they were saying, but I couldn't understand it. They didn't want me to know what they were saying, and because of this, I couldn't know what they were saying. Such is the nature of things. The weird one said, "My name is—" "How much is the toll?" the bald orc interrupted. I looked at my friend, demonstrating my annoyance to them privately, and then turned back to the group. "That depends. I'll need your name, please," I answered with an authoritative tone. "And what, pray tell, will you be doing with our names if we give them to you?" the bald one asked with a grin. So the game begins. It's possible that he's figured it out, but we're well versed with this particular battle of wits. They would have to be crazy to hurl accusations at guards, and that works out well because we're trying to avoid the crazy ones. I'll be writing it down and checking to see if it's already in my other book. If it is, then you'll pay a discounted toll or even no toll at all. If it's not, then we discuss how much the toll is, I answered, trying my best not to grin. And the rest of the group was looking at the bald one with confusion. The gnome looked back at me, and some glint of clarification scrolled across, otherwise his boring features. "Damn it. May I see this other book that our names may already be in?" the bald one asked. "For what purpose would you need to see the book other than to attempt to fraud us?" I countered. "I'll not entertain a scoundrel. Now give me your name." "I am not a scoundrel. I am simply curious as to why a Fae would be collecting taxes for the kingdom of Bolser." "Ah, so he knows that we're Fae. Not necessarily a problem, as he may not yet have guessed our intentions." I heard a sigh come from my friend, and I held out a hand to calm them. The game isn't over yet. "Why wouldn't a Fae be collecting taxes?" I asked. "Have you never seen an employed Fae before?" "Can't say that I have, and you know how we mortals are. We're suspicious of things we haven't seen before," he grinned. "What use would you even have for currency?" "To purchase goods and services, of course." "Doesn't the forest provide everything your kind desires?" "Obviously not, or we wouldn't be here." "What sort of things do you buy?" "I don't need to tell you that. All I need is your names," I stated coldly. "Why don't you set our minds at ease by telling us your name first?" the bald one asked. Slithering copulation. The orc was familiar with my kind and knew how to play this game. It seemed like an innocent enough request, a name for a name, but he knew damned well what he was doing by asking for ours. The bastard had even phrased it in such a way that it would be suspicious were I to decline. I didn't particularly feel like playing the fool and dancing around the subject, and a quick look at my friend told me that they didn't want to either. Very well, begging it is. Fair enough, I said. We do not have names. We require them, which is why we're asking for yours. Oh, the weird one said, finally catching on. Why would you need our names, though? The orc with braids asked. Can't you name yourselves? If we could, we would, my friend said. We cannot, and as such beg your kindness. Their feminine form was specifically designed to appeal to the mortal sense of lust in a situation like this. Mine was masculine and intended to have the same effect on those with the opposite preference. It's hard to say no to a sexy fae in uniform. Unfortunately, this tactic was lost on the orcs. Their auras did not indicate nearly enough cruelty for them to be wild by our physical distractions. The dwarf and the gnome, perhaps, but they were both being careful not to even look at us. That only left the thing. I stifled a shudder at the thought. If we give you our names, then what will we be called? The bald one asked, still grinning. I said haltingly. It was a surprising question. I don't know, actually. Probably whatever you want, my friend added. That's how it works with you mortals, isn't it? Not quite, the bald one said. When you take our names, you take our identity and merge it with your own, leaving us without knowledge of who we are. Silence fell among us. Fear riddled the auras of the other mortals. My friend and I shared confused glances. Why would they be afraid of not knowing who they are? Aren't mortals only afraid of death or serious injury? I don't understand. You say that like it's a bad thing, I ventured. But that's how we live. I do not have a name and therefore don't know who I am. Well, imagine for a moment that you did have a name. Imagine that you know who you are, your identity impacts the world around you, and you have many tales to tell to those who would listen. Would you willingly part with that? The bald one asked sagely. Do you feel it right to take that from someone else? No, I wouldn't willingly part with it, but life is about taking from the things around you to further your own existence, I said. You need energy to complete yourselves, so you take the lives of animals, and those animals take the lives of plants for the same purpose. We take your identities for our completion, to further our existence just as you do. What happens if you don't? The weird one asked hesitantly. We perish, my friend said. Our story ends as the season does, if we do not have an identity to anchor us. They get reborn, though, the bald one explained. Death is temporary to a fae. It's not exactly pleasant, though, I said. The withering alone is likely much more painful than anything you've ever experienced. Also, our sense of self gets reset. Who we are fades to nothingness when we die. And we are someone different when we are reborn, my friend added. I thought you didn't have a sense of self, the weird one said. Of course we do. It's what drives us to gain an identity, I explained. Without an identity, we lose our current sense of self to the void. Sure, we're born again come next season, but we will have different personalities, preferences, and no memory of who we were before. We end up becoming a completely different fae. Which explains why you would want our names. The bald one nodded slowly. However, we need our names. There are those who depend upon us. Even if we tried to force the issue, they're smart enough to know that they can remove any obstacles we put in their path. Should we let them continue on and just hope someone dumber comes along? Is there some way we can convince them? Perhaps a bribe or a promise? No, I can feel their determination. This won't work. We will need to regroup and find another... Wait, all you need are names, right? The weird one asked. What if we named you? Well, I paused and looked at my friend, who shrugged. Names have power. You would have to sacrifice a large amount of magic to name us, and we would have to be willing to accept the name. For what reason would you not accept the name? The bald one asked. I looked at my friend again. Revealing this could prove dangerous, but they gestured for me to continue. They're right, of course. We're in too deep to hold back now. I sighed and straightened my borrowed uniform nervously. If you name us, you will be taking part in our creation, and we will be forever in your debt. I realize that your kind uses this as a turn of phrase, but we mean it literally. We would be under your authority for as long as you are able to give us orders, and anything you order us to do, we will have to do. I explained. So we are left with a conundrum. Which is better, slavery or death? It would just be temporary, my friend giggled. They're mortals, after all. What if I promise not to order you around? The weird one asked. You can make promises unbreakable, right? The innocence of that question took me off guard. I looked at the strange being, as if seeing it for the first time. I had been avoiding looking directly at it because of the maelstrom that is its aura, but once I looked past that, I realized that I was looking at a young boy. An odd young boy whose ears and teeth were wrong, but one who was genuine in its beliefs. My heart melted somewhat as I realized that this innocent youth actually believed that kind of power was possible. It didn't melt enough to keep me from taking full advantage of this mistaken belief, though. I quickly thought of a bluff and a way to make that bluff convincing. It would require a blood pact, but yes, I lied. Okay, the thing said as it leapt from the cart. How do we do that? As the weird one approached me, it suddenly occurred to me that mixing my blood with this thing might be a bad idea. Blood is an odd thing, and the mixing of it can lead to some strange happenings. It had been the first thing to leap to mind, though, and now I have to go with it, because it would be suspicious. Unless I can think of something. It's simple, I said, trying desperately to think of something to get me out of this. In your own words, express your promise and the consequences of not adhering to it. Then, if I agree to your promise, we cut our palms and clasp hands. Our blood will mingle, and the promise will become binding. And then I can name you, and we can be on our way, it said happily. Got it. It stood before me, and we met each other's gaze as it thought of what to say. The dark blue of its glimmering eyes reminded me of the shiny stones that the fairies loved to steal from wandering merchants. Inside this deep blue was a hint of green, which is reminiscent of the grove in which I'd been reborn. The eyes of mortals are such beautiful things. I can definitely see why the hags collect them. I hereby promise that I will not intentionally force a fae to perform any action against their will by enforcing their debt to me. May I die if I break this promise. I went over the sentence in my mind to make sure it hadn't performed any trickery with its words. The promise wouldn't be binding, but I still had to call out any trickery to make sure it believed the performance. Using the word intentional made certain that if it accidentally enforced the debt, it could simply apologize, and it made sure to clarify that enforcing the debt would be the breach of promise. So if it came to odds with a fae, it still had recourse. The consequence was rather mundane, but it served the purpose of ensuring that it couldn't become our master. The thing would only be able to give one order. Clever. Unfortunately, I still hadn't thought of a way out of mingling our blood. But I decided that I liked this weird little child. What's the worst that could happen if we mix blood? I smiled and gave a nod of assent. Then I hardened the nail of my left forefinger into a sharp edge and sliced my right palm deep enough for blood to flow. The weird one offered its hand, and I made a similar cut on the offered palm. I held my hand up with my fingers spread apart as the weird one extended its hand forward. It looked at my hand and back to its own, as I looked at its hand and back to my own. Our eyes met again, and I raised my eyebrow, wondering what it was doing. Its lips disappeared as it made an awkward expression, and it finally clasped its hand with mine. I froze as our blood mingled, and a shock ran through my form. A life began to flash before my eyes. Chapter 35. Adventurer level, not applicable. Glimpses of memory poured through me. Structures of glass, stone, and steel that rose to the clouds, a testament to extreme levels of effort and coordination. Children laughing and playing among carefully cultivated nature without a care in the world. Video games, homework, martial arts lessons, stretches of ground covered with a sticky black substance that gets really hot in the summertime. Burnt feet, skinned knees, dirty pants. The mingled smells of freshly cooked carcass and various vegetables crafted into a hamburger. Poor, kind plants, skinned, sliced, and shredded, but turned into delightful snacks. The feeling of entering a warm home on a cold winter's day. A world devoid of magic or my kind, but still beautiful in a haunting way. There were other memories too. A beautiful girl with golden hair, wasting away from illness, a stern but kind father and a loving mother. Childhood friends and enemies maturing over time. A cold darkness with the dulled sensation of flesh being carved and stitched back together. Pain, healing. A dissonant whisper within the dark, urging something incomprehensible. More pain, much more pain, only bearable because the mind doesn't notice it. A long stretch of sleep, more whispers but intelligible, more healing. Orcs. An unbidden tear rolled down my cheek as I realized the thing before me is Nicodemus Liam Smith. A human, far from home, with a false mind entangled within his own, who dearly wishes to return. The orcs in the cart are his adopted brothers, who are trying to help him get back. A marvelous tragedy. No wonder he's being closely watched by... That will be all, Nick, I said, trying not to finish that thought. Yeah, Nick replied, releasing my hand. Tears openly rolled down his cheeks as well. I'm sorry, I didn't know that would happen. I know. Don't worry, I forgive you. You have a beautiful home, he smiled at me, wiping his eyes. As do you. What now? You mean now that you know? I trailed off. That the blood pact is bullshit? He chuckled. Yeah. Well, I've seen your memories. I know that you won't betray your promise without good reason. I only ask that you explain that reason if the time comes. So we're doing this, my friend asked, strolling up next to me. Nick has my consent, I said, finally wiping my tear. Yours? Of course. You're the one who cares about your precious freedom. I don't care about whether or not it bosses me around for a few decades. I just want to keep being me. I nodded at Nick, who returned the gesture and began to think. I waited nervously, wondering what name would become mine, and if he would even be powerful enough to pull it off. He's got a lot of magic, but I don't actually know how much is needed. Hurry up, will you? My friend demanded. Sorry, it's hard to come up with names on the spot like this, Nick said. Do you have any, I don't know, preferences? I'm fine with anything that isn't Tinkerbell, Titania, Puck, or Oberon, I laughed. Nick chuckled as my friend tapped their chin. What's the mortal word for breasts that I like? Boobs, Nick asked. Nope. Jugs? No, those hold water. Bust? Not even close. Tits, I interjected with an exaggerated sigh. Yes, my friend shouted, jumping with glee. That's what I want my name to be, Nick. The human's smile faded to a look of shock. He looked at me as if to ask if my friend was joking. I slowly shook my head and shrugged. He looked back toward my friend and gathered himself. Really? He asked. You're serious? Never a day in my life, but I do want to be called Tits, my friend said with an impish grin. It's representative of a mother's love and nurturing nature, while also being lewd and inappropriate. What's not to love? All right, well, I name you Tits Igai, he said as the air was forced from his lungs. My friend began to glow, and I immediately recognized them as Tits, a fae from the deep wild forest. But something was wrong. Tits' aura was glowing brighter than it should. Playfulness, glee, joy, guile, and all the other emissions were joined by another. Authority. Tits was no longer simply a fae, they were now an archfae, and my eyes bulged at the realization. I glanced back at Nick, who was holding his knees, trying to get his breath back. Tits grabbed my hand and jumped up and down. It worked, they shouted with glee. I'm Tits now. You're an archfae now, I said coldly, an archfae named Tits. Mummel Dobran is going to have a conniption. Are you all right, Nick? The orc with the braids, Nash, called from the cart. Yeah, Nick shouted back. Just took the wind out of me. Tits grabbed Nick's hands next, jumping up and down in excitement. I noticed that they put some extra jiggle into their fleshy bits too. Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much. If you ever need anything from me, feel free to ask. And I mean anything, Tits said with a wink. Might as well give up on that offer, I interrupted. Nick won't bend to temptation. How do you know? Tits asked. I can be very persuasive. I'll tell you later. Pff, fine, your turn. What's a good name for you? A creeping realization hit me. If Nick names me, there's a chance that I may become an arch-fae as well. The fae will flock around me while laughing and playing, but the forest will demand my guidance. Will it come naturally? Will I have to work at it? Will I be a kind and just leader who is much beloved? Will I be an abusive tyrant twisted by power into something unrecognizable by my current self? Or, worst of all, will I be the incompetent buffoon who destroys our home? I don't know, I said after a few moments. I don't know either, Nick said. I couldn't understand the speech in most of your memories. The sounds were pretty, but when I try to say them, they won't come out. Of course, sweetie, Tits said. Mortals cannot speak Fae. Wait, Nick comes from another world, but I was able to understand what the people in his memories were saying, I added, even the ones who weren't. People. Careful, there are some things that are best left unaddressed, Tits sighed. The reason you could understand the words in Nick's memories is because of the gift of gab, granted to us by one of those things that are best left unaddressed. The only words we can't understand are those that aren't supposed to be understood. Nick and I were taken aback by Tits' sudden change in demeanor. They'd gone from nearly sprite-like to serious and intellectual in the blink of an eye. Our stares caused Tits to grin widely, though. You'll know what I know once Nick names you. You got another one in you, right, Nick? Tits asked. Yeah, that took less than half of my magic, Nick smiled. I'm good to give another name. Question is, what should it be? Well, definitely not a name based on sexualized mortal appendages, if you don't mind. I shook my head. Something intelligent would be nice. Shouldn't be a commonly used proper name, though, Tits added, something as unique as possible. Smart and unique, Nick rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Maybe something to do with math, algebra, calculus, calculator, abacus. Oh, abacon. Sounds a bit… Wait, how's that spelled? I asked. A-B-A-C-O-N, I think. A bacon, really? Uh-oh, Tits interrupted. I think you've made them abacross. Go suck off a worgen, I replied, incensed by the pun. Hey now, don't be abacrass. You see, I said to Nick, you can't name me that. You'll be dooming me to an eternity of torture via wordplay. Okay, Nick held up his hands defensively. What about algebron? Tits and I looked at each other. I could tell that they were desperately trying to think of a pun, and I grinned evilly when their face revealed an expression of utter disappointment. Yes, I think that will do nicely, I nodded. All right, I hereby name you Algebron. His voice faded as my eyes were clouded by the glow coming from my form. Pure, raw power coursed through me like lightning, striking over and over again. Time halted, and I was suddenly free from my form entirely. It was now little more than a puppet, and I was now its puppeteer. I could feel the forest in ways I had never dreamed possible. I instinctively knew that I was now charged with maintaining it and doing everything I could to properly raise the fae and fair folk who thrived within it. I now knew all of their little plans, pranks and plots, and laughed at how futile they were. Along with this duty came knowledge. I knew that if I had somehow obtained this knowledge without the power that came with it, I would have been made insane. A blabbering fool doomed to wander the lands, desperately trying to warn others of what's to come. But with this power, I had become more than a pawn in the game. I was now a player, and I could prevent what's to come. I can save everyone and everything that I hold dear. I gazed at Nick, still frozen in the act of doubling over from the recoil of the spell he didn't even realize he cast. Magic that exists outside of the Curaguard. I saw the chains of debt connecting Tits and I to him. But even so, his existence was still a mystery to me. It shouldn't be, but the High Ones were guarding him like a child guards a precious toy. They hid him away from prying eyes that would use him to further their own devices. When one considers the fallibility of mortal memory, I likely know this boy better than he knows himself. I know that he considers his favorite food to be the spaghetti his mother makes every other Saturday, but it's actually the hash browns and eggs his father crafts daily. I know that he loves lizards and is irrationally afraid of the bugs that look like leaves. I know that his most embarrassing moment is when he didn't make it to the toilet in time in first grade and had to be sent home after soiling himself. But I don't know his fate. I looked at the orcs and couldn't tell theirs either. The three altar boys had fully intertwined their futures, and because of Nick, those futures were now uncertain. The dwarf and the gnome had somewhat uncertain fates, but they were far less intertwined. I was able to divine what could happen to them at least. I felt something akin to warmth from Tits, who was in a form similar to mine own. Their happiness contrasted perfectly with my grim concerns. I informed them of how blessed they are to be able to be gleeful in the face of what we now know. They informed me that what we now know doesn't have a face, and I couldn't help but laugh. We embraced, our energies mingling and tickling and charging each other up. We now have eternity to ourselves. We had been partners from the moment of our rebirth, and now not even the seasons themselves could separate us. Together, we would guide our forest forevermore. I turned my attention back toward Nick, and time resumed its march. "Are you all right, Nick?" Tits Puppet asked. Yeah, the boy replied. "I'm going to need a nap, I think." "I would nap in the cart. Were I you," I made my puppet say. "There are many things in this area that wouldn't hesitate to take advantage of sleeping meat." "Of course. Did it work? Is your name Algebron?" he asked. "Yes, I am Algebron, Archfey of the Deep Wild Forest," I answered. "Pleasure to meet you." "Wait, you're different now?" "Yes, it's growth, like how you are now different from yourself as a babe." "Same with you, Tits?" "Of course, before you named me, I couldn't do this," Tits said as their form's breasts grew noticeably larger, stretching the limits of the uniform adorning them. I chuckled as Nick blushed at the sight, turning his head so that he didn't stare. Even though his heart belonged to another, the incessant urge to procreate is strong in most mortals his age. Knowing him as I do, he'll continue to fight the temptations, no matter the form they arrive in. I find this worthy of respect, but I suspect that Tits finds it a bit frustrating. "So," he paused to collect himself, "what will you two do now?" "We'll return to our home. We now have duties to tend to," I explained. "I'm going to play so many pranks," Tits added. "What kind of duties?" Nick asked. "We are charged with the growth and maintenance of the deep wild forest. We will teach the Fae within to care for the plants and animals that make the forest what it is," I said with a smile. "And we will defend the forest if need be." "So you're like a king and queen of the Fae?" "Nope, more like a mommy and daddy." "And we've got lots of babies to take care of," Tits said. "Do you want to be one of my babies? I'll let you nurse from—" "Enough," I interrupted. "He'll not be swayed, Tits." Nick gave me a look of gratitude as Tits frowned. Their breasts shrank back to their earlier size, and they crossed their arms to indicate displeasure. I sighed at the sulky display. Eternity is going to be interesting at least. "One last question before you go, if you don't mind," Nick said. "Who is that person you mentioned before? Mum something? Mummy Bran?" Tits and I looked at each other for a moment before laughing gleefully at Nick's butchering of Mummeldobran's name. His frown did little to ease our laughter. After a few moments, I took a deep breath and composed myself. Mummeldobran is a sort of patron to the Fae. Normally, it decides who is and isn't worthy of becoming an archfey, I answered, wiping tears of laughter from my eyes. "Will they be mad that I made you two archfey?" Nick asked with fear in his tone. "Probably not," I assured him. "Mummeldobran isn't particularly invested in the growth of the Fae. It's more of a judge of character than anything. As a judge of character, it will likely be displeased at Tits' ascension, but it probably won't blame you for that." "Oh, okay. I'm glad." "We should go," Tits said. "We need to tend to our home, and they need to return to their journey." "I agree," I said. "I am grateful for this gift, Nick. If you are ever in need, seek us out. You know where to find us." "Okay, it was good meeting you two," the boy said with a warm smile. "Good to meet you as well," Tits and I said simultaneously. Nick's companions watched us as he went back to the carts. With a wave of my hand, I rid the road of our illusory checkpoint. Tits and I stood to the side as the mortals drove past, waving to them as they went. They waved back with varying levels of enthusiasm. Ulak gave a strong and glad wave. He had been watching our exchange with the utmost scrutiny, and I couldn't help but wonder what he made of it all. Nash was much more muted in the way that he waved, likely because he wisely didn't trust us. The gnome and the dwarf waved politely, and Nick waved excitedly. I hope they find a way to take him home. Chapter 36. Master General Kirain Yeath. Adventurer level, not applicable. Half-breed Drow, Balushinian. What a wonderful night. I let out a happy sigh as I allowed the ambience to wash over me, enjoying the smell of fires and blood, the sounds of screaming in the distance, and the sight of Drow tossing mangled corpses into the mass grave at the bottom of the hill. It is a rare treat to be rewarded so handsomely for such a meagre task. Well, meagre for me at least. The orcs residing here had not wanted to let this village fall under our control and had put up quite a fight. They'd had some forewarning as to our intentions, but we had managed to mask our movements and surprise them. Even so, we took losses. I watched General Smarn jog up the hill in my direction. "Reporting, sir," he said, slightly out of breath. "I'll have to ensure my officers participate in morning calisthenics with the soldiers. Not only will this improve their constitution, but it will improve the morale of the soldiers as well, which will ensure the soldiers will follow the more difficult orders when they're finally given." "Get on with it, Smarn," I replied. "Yes, sir," he snapped to attention. "Ultris Squads 2 and 4 have made contact with the enemy. Both skirmishes ended in our victory. We've taken 4 casualties and 2 deaths as a result of the action." "And what of the enemy?" 16 confirmed kills and 4 captures. The rest fled the field in a suspicious manner. The squads did not pursue due to suspicions of an ambush. Their commanders will be punished at the Master General's pleasure. I couldn't help but smirk at the results of our fighting. The orcs were tough, disciplined, and crafty enemies, but they couldn't stand up to the formations I'd fashioned. Shield walls and spears are well outside the wheelhouse of a standard orc commander, let alone a hastily established village militia. Unfortunately, this success was likely to change somewhat when we begin to encounter regulars. The orcs we've been fighting aren't part of a greater military effort. For the most part, they're simply guards and farmers who've taken up weapons to try to drive us off. There's the occasional uppity adventurer, but even they can't fight an entire phalanx. According to the literature that I'd gleaned the idea from, such maneuvers are vulnerable only to artillery, which is difficult to position during a skirmish. Unless you lead your enemy into a pre-arranged position, of course, there is no need for punishment. They were likely correct in assuming it was a trap, and we have no reason to pursue the enemy when they flee at this point in the campaign. "This is a land grab, not an extermination," I said, as I casually pushed my hair from my eyes. "But," General Smarn glanced at the freshly ruined village, "this was not an extermination either, General. We simply needed a more permanent base of operations and a source of labor," I explained. "This village has food and water and will serve as a nexus between our forces and our supply lines for the rest of our campaign. Obviously, we can't have the populace trying to prevent the village's transformation into our nexus, which is why we killed those who wouldn't surrender or couldn't work. Rebels and spies would undermine our efforts." The general looked at me with doubt apparent in his expression. There are few things more offensive than having a dolt doubt you. Would that I could carve that expression from his face. Feeling my fury flare and knowing that this was not an appropriate time to free it, I took a deep breath with my mouth and exhaled it through my nose. There were plenty of survivors, and all of the survivors that surrendered have been relegated to our labor force, I said with exasperation. Speaking of which, ensure that those that are captured during skirmishes are treated for any injuries they have. Once their treatment is complete, make sure they join the labor force. That will be all." "Yes, sir," Smarn said before trotting off to carry out my orders. One may call it a mixed blessing that King Lofin requires foolishness to be an inherent trait among his military leaders. On the one hand, it requires much more hand-holding to get anything done. To make sure things are done correctly, you must give explicit and exact instructions every time you give orders. On the other hand, not a single one of them has questioned the need for a labor force, especially one made entirely of orcs. I sighed as I entered my newest domicile. I had meticulously crafted several well-thought-out answers to their potential questions, and had even gone so far as to plan assassinations if those answers hadn't been accepted. A pointless effort, as it turned out. I truly am surrounded by incompetent fools. Well, perhaps not. The officers commanding the squads would have to have their wits about them to avoid the orcish traps as they had. For a moment I considered promoting them, but dismissed this thought almost immediately. They are far enough down the chain of command to be afraid of questioning orders. If I promote them enough, this will change and I will have to be rid of them. No, they are far more useful where they are. I was lost in these thoughts when something out of place caught my notice. I stood still and examined the room around me. My sister's cage was nestled in the corner, undisturbed. The hatch to our freshly dug storeroom lay undisturbed in the other corner, still closed and latched. The wooden walls were still covered in the various animal heads, herbal wreaths, and the other eccentricities that the previous denizen had placed there. A gentle breeze was moving the blackened curtains that I'd ordered hanged. The breeze was coming from a window that had previously been closed. Having found the disturbance that wrestled me from my thoughts, I took a step toward the window. "Good evening, Master General," an obviously fanged mouth said behind me. I briefly froze but fought my fear. "Hello, Alurgas," I said, turning to the vampire. "How fare you this evening?" Alurgas Tuvino, the vampire that told me of my father's death, had been a count when the vampires had ruled the Night Kingdom. Before that, he had been a muscular but otherwise unimpressive specimen of elf. Were it not for his obviously elven features, one could easily mistake him for a tall dwarf. The window that he had entered through allowed for enough of a breeze to stir his cosmetically straightened light brown hair as his green eyes glowered at me with barely disguised contempt. I would be faring far better had I not been assigned to the whimsy of a half-breed. Alurgas practically snarled. "What do you need of me, whelp?" Anger, rage even, it shot through me like a white-hot iron in my skull. My politeness had been met with hostility. How dare this disrespectful reprobate address me in this manner? I fought the urge to attack the vampire. I'd been feeding regularly, but it would be a close fight, and it would likely spill out into the camp. My upper echelon hadn't thought to ask any questions until now, but even they aren't dumb enough to have no questions about a vampire attack this far south. Not to mention the fact that I would definitely have to bare my fangs. It would also be difficult to have another vampire assigned to this task, especially once I explained what happened to Alurgas. I would have to come up with a reasonable cause for my attack on him, and losing my temper would not be considered reasonable. I will resist his baiting for now. "Yes, I do have need of you. At this moment there are captured orcs digging out a chamber beneath this lodge," I calmly explained. "I need you to find 2 of them that would be sympathetic to our cause and turn them. My officers have chosen a few to be leaders of this labor detail, so you should start with them. They are the ones with clothing. Use your hypnosis to determine if they will be loyal. If so, turn them. If not, make them forget the encounter." "What's the point of only turning 2 of them?" he asked haughtily. Another downside to having subordinates who are somewhat competent is that they waste time by demanding explanations. These orcs are part of a forced labor group, and their work is not finished. If you turn all of them, we will not have a catacomb to build a new vampire army. Vampires make poor slaves after all. He recognized my last sentence as the insult it was intended to be, and his eyes flashed red in response. But he didn't do anything other than stare. Instead of joining him in a stare-down, I took my seat and gestured at a freshly installed hatch. As far as my officers are aware, the orcs are digging a storeroom for our supplies and loot. They didn't ask why I needed a personal entrance to what would become our cache, and so I hadn't offered an excuse. The red glow in Alurgas' eyes faded, and he sucked his teeth at me. Then he entered the hatch to go on about his task. I chuckled at my minor victory over the pompous asshole. He would do as he was told, and the plan would move forward. He might skip over the obvious choices for conversion, but I'd planned for that as well. If he didn't choose the orcs that were already in charge of the labor force, those orcs would die, and the vampires would take their place. The storeroom is also to serve as housing for any slaves that we capture. A competent commander would immediately be alarmed at putting all of our eggs in one basket like this, but no such commander was in my army. Once the storeroom is large enough, and we have enough slaves, it will suffer an intentional accidental collapse of its 2 primary entrances. This will ensure that everyone in the army believes the slaves to be dead. The two vampires will then convert the rest of the slaves, creating a nice little army of vampires. This army will then finish digging the third entrance to the storeroom, and we will then take our leave of this area and meet with the rest of the vampiric forces to lay waste to Cuvelia, the capital of the Night Kingdom. King Lofin will die, and the rest of the Drow forces will be trapped between the enraged orcs and bloodthirsty vampires. Even with the tactics that I have trained them on, they'll be eradicated. If I am lucky, they will do enough damage to the vampiric hordes to make it easier for me to destroy them. Trap the Drow forces between the vampires and the orcs, then trap the vampires between the orcs and my loyalists. Or I could bide my time and play politics among the vampires, waiting for a better chance to strike. That would be a far more dangerous option, though. No, there's no reason to delay. The campaign to destroy the remaining Drow should take a few months. I'll seize my prize for killing King Lofin, and with magical intervention, I'll have a small army of brood by the time the Drow warriors are dead. That will supplement the Drow forces that are loyal to me and awaiting my call, and we will move to exterminate the vampires. I rested my elbows on my knees and cradled my hands as I studied the map in front of me. Directly to our north was the Night Kingdom. Our foothold doesn't extend that far into Blurpus, one of the 5 chiefdoms of the unified chiefdoms that we are aware of. There are more to the south, but they are of little concern to King Lofin, and as such aren't on any of my maps. Blurpus, Yrna, Havros, Mygrath, and Kirkena, the capital. These are the chiefdoms that Lofin once conquered every once in a while. Each chiefdom has their own military forces and a great chief to lead them. In Kirkena, the great chief is called High Chief, and he rules over the other chiefs. Blurpus and Yrna share a border with the Night Kingdom, and they take turns being invaded. The only reason we weren't met with regulars at the border is because it was supposed to be Yrna's turn this time. I chuckled softly. If King Lofin demands an explanation, I will simply say that I was confused and invaded the wrong chiefdom by mistake. I doubt he's paying much attention, though. The hatch in the corner opened, and Allergus exited the storeroom. He let the hatch fall noisily and kicked the latch closed. Then he turned and affixed me with a glare. "It's done," he said. "Good, that's all I needed," I said with a condescending smile. "You may go." I was treated to another shift from green to red eyes as the vampire debated whether or not to attack me. If he did, I wouldn't have to worry about the other vampires making a fuss if I killed him. I'd still have to come up with an explanation for my soldiers, but I'm willing to live with that. I tensed in anticipation. Disappointingly, the creature snarled and morphed into a kavat and attempted to exit through the still open window. I chuckled as he struggled with the heavy black curtain until he finally managed to complete his exit. I stood and walked over to the window, closing it. Another part of the plan completed. Chapter 37. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 7, Human American. "So Bolser is the kingdom, right?" I asked. "Yes," Renv said. "So, what's the name of the city we're going to?" Ulak chuckled. "It doesn't work that way with the elves of this kingdom. The whole thing is Bolser. If I remember right, it's a tradition that dates back to their founding." "That's right," Renv said. "The first High Dragon ruler of Bolser was notably terrible at names. Instead of admitting to this fault, she opted to name everything under her direct control Bolser after herself. Even when her kingdom expanded, the new territories were renamed Bolser. None of the rulers after Bolser bothered to rename anything, and now everything that is part of the kingdom of Bolser is simply known as Bolser. Maybe high dragons are just bad at naming things," I joked. Everyone chuckled. "It goes a bit beyond that, though," Renv said. "Not only is everything Bolser, there are no borders within the kingdom. Everything functions kind of like a big city." "That explains why the fair folk like it so much," Nash muttered. "Why?" I asked. "Because borders can be an issue with them," Ulak explained. "Some types of fae and fairy get trapped within the imaginary lines that we mortals insist upon. The more people believe in the border, the harder it is for them to cross. Bolser is a big kingdom, so they have plenty of room to roam and grow. I kind of feel for the ones who get trapped in a forest, only to have that forest get smaller and smaller as the towns and cities grow around them," Nash said. It's usually the meekest of the fair folk that end up in that kind of situation too. What about Tits and Algebrun? I'm not sure, Ulak scratched his chin. It could be that the road goes through their forest, and as such is part of it. Or maybe they're a type of fae that isn't restricted by the power of borders. According to the maps that we have seen, the deep wild forest does not extend over the road we were traveling when we encountered the fae. Ulak's second hypothesis is likely correct, Ten said. Yeah, you're probably right, I said to Ulak and Ten both. I sat back and watched our surroundings as we continued to the heart of Bolser, where we would meet the High Dragon. I wonder what it'll look like. Will it look like a dinosaur with wings, like the dragons in European folklore? Or will it resemble a snake, like the dragons in Asia? Or will it look like something else entirely? Will it wake up and talk to me, or will something else happen while we're looking at the dragon? I've been trying not to think about my dream. The thing that told me to go see the dragon, whether it's a god or not, gives me the creeps. It said there's a bunch of other things like it watching me too. It's been hard not to think about that during bathroom breaks. Suddenly, it occurred to me that I had forgotten to tell Ten about my dream. I hadn't had a chance to tell Nash or Ulak yet, but I don't have that excuse with Ten. Maybe I just sort of assumed it already knew, since it's in my head and everything. Ten, do you know anything about gods? I asked it. Gods and religions are not part of my knowledge base. Why? When I used all my magic and passed out, I had some sort of dream. Except it wasn't really a dream. It was more like my mind had been transported to somewhere else entirely. Something that said it was a god brought me there. It said that Ulak's going to decline an invitation to see the High Dragon, and I shouldn't let that happen. When I was out, did you notice anything weird about my brain? There was a noticeable pause before Ten finally said, I did not. It appeared to me as if you were simply unconscious. Were there any indications of a wild dream or something? No, the brain activity that I observed wasn't indicative of dreaming. Isn't that odd? Yes, but your dream may simply be a false memory that you obtained upon awakening, likely as a way to cope with the trauma you had just experienced. If it is real, though, I would suggest a modicum of caution. We have little to no information about gods or their intentions, and it would not be wise to do as they demand blindly. You're probably right, but I'm still going to convince Ulak to see the High Dragon. Really? Yeah, call it a hunch, but I feel like it was telling the truth this time. And if I can't trust my feelings, then I'm probably too far gone to be resisting it now, right? Ten went silent instead of laughing at my somewhat dark humor. I allowed myself a small smile before I noticed that the trees around us were getting larger and larger. The trunks were also getting wider, so wide it took an entire minute for us to pass one, and it wasn't long before the trees began to block the sun. We're here, Imlaw said as the cart stopped. I looked around and noticed that we had stopped at a building that had been carved into a tree. It had a sign with a coin on it, hanging above its door, probably indicating that it was some sort of trader. Further down the road were many other similar buildings, all with lights adorning them. The visual was surreal. All right, let's deliver our letter, Nash said, climbing out of the cart. Ulak, Renv and I followed suit, and Imlaw waved happily at us as we started to walk away. Ulak and Nash were examining signs as we walked. It was like they were looking for a specific one. We walked past one with a plate on it, and Renv's stomach growled. You're still following us? Nash asked the dwarf. Well, once you conclude your business here, I was thinking I can take you to my uncle's shop to see about a reward for saving my hide. Renv grinned. Plus, I'm curious to see what you lot get up to. Do you know your way around? Nope, I live down south a ways and haven't been up here in over a year. I'm pretty sure my uncle upgraded to a bigger building recently, but I've got no clue where it is. That's okay, Ulak said. He pointed at a building with a sign depicting a pen and paper attached to a large stable with several hnazes. As we got closer, we could hear the ruckus of commerce taking place. Nash and Ulak entered the building first, and Renv held his hand out in a gesture indicating I should go first. I did so, and the smell of fresh ink and paper hit me like a ton of bricks, nearly making my eyes water. Inside the building were bookcases behind a counter, several desks, and many elves and gnomes rushing around. Most of them were wearing a uniform, light tan shorts and tunic with a green symbol of a pen on their breast, and I assumed they were employees of whatever business this is. Those that weren't in uniform weren't rushing around. They were waiting in line in front of the counter or sitting at one of the desks with an employee. The customers, I assume, would say something to the employee, then the employee would write. It took a few moments for me to realize that the customers were probably dictating letters or something. I glanced at Nash, remembering his illiteracy. He saw me glance at him and looked around, then gave me a harsh glare. I looked away, trying not to smile. He grumbled something as we took our place in line. "What is this place?" I asked Ulak. "It's a mail office. They offer dictating services, reading services, delivery services, and since they know where everything is, they can give good directions," he explained, "which is why we're here." "Directions to the Regent?" "Correct. I haven't been here before, so I don't know where Regent Oakmore does business." "I thought you've been to Bolser." "I have, but not this part of it. My business was with a certain sorcerer who built a tower in the forest, far away from any signs of civilization. She was much friendlier than you would expect from a hermit." "This sorcerer you're talking about wouldn't happen to be Olmyra the Eternal, would it?" Renv asked. "Yes, the very same. She taught me how to use healing magic," Ulak said with a smile. "It seems like forever ago." "How do you know her?" "Olmyra's one of the healers I was talking about sharing your discovery with. She's one of Oakmore's advisors now. She'll probably be around here somewhere. I'll check when I ask for directions to my uncle." "How'd she end up advisor to a regent?" "She said it was because of the pests. Turns out, a tower in the wilderness, occupied by just one person, is a great place for bugs and rodents. One day she went into her cellar only to find a nest of giant rats, and she lost it. Demolished the whole tower then and there. She dug her savings out of the rubble and moved here. Didn't take long for Oakmore to offer her a job." "Why is she called the Eternal?" I asked as we moved closer to the front of the line. "She's a vampire," Ulak and Renv said simultaneously. They looked at each other and chuckled. "Oh, how does a vampire get blood when they're living as a hermit?" "Delivery services," Ulak said. "There are plenty of people willing to sell their blood, and the vampires who prefer not to injure people are more than happy to pay for it. Enchanted ice boxes keep the blood from rotting during transit." "There are services like that?" I asked incredulously. "Vampires just sort of order from a catalogue, or what?" "I don't think the services offer specific blood types, but you'll find such a service in nearly every territory. Sometimes they're even endorsed by the local government. It wouldn't do to have your vampiric citizens feeding on your other citizens." I had more questions, but the person ahead of us finished their business and it was suddenly our turn at the counter. As we approached, I realized the bookcases had letters in them and there were gnomes busy sorting those letters. A brunette elf smiled at us, and Ulak stepped forward. "How can I help you today?" she asked. "We need directions to Regent Oakmore's place of business," Ulak explained. "We have a delivery for him." She explained that all we had to do was follow the main road and look for a building with a sign that depicted a tree. The tree was apparently the symbol of Bolser and marked government offices and officials. She was also kind enough to tell us that if we went further down the main road, we would find the sleeping dragon. She highly recommended taking a guided tour if we got the chance. "Thank you," Ulak said, and stepped aside so Renv could have his turn at the counter. We waited for the dwarf to ascertain his uncle's location and then left the post office. As we walked down the main road, I wondered how things were going to unfold. I assume someone is going to invite us on the tour to see the dragon, and Ulak is going to decline this invitation. I'm going to have to somehow convince him to accept the invitation. That's going to be hard, because I still haven't had a chance to be alone with my brothers and explain my dream to them. "There it is," Nash said, pointing at a building. Most of the buildings were within hollowed-out tree trunks. This one, though, looked like it was made of very old stone. It reminded me of the kind of stone you see a castle made out of in a fantasy movie. There were also plenty of people on the road, but none of them seemed at all interested in going in or out of the building. The doors were made of metal, iron probably, and swung open surprisingly easy as we entered. The first thing I noticed within the building was the distinct smell of stale paper. Like the air within this building had been here for years, and had been reading all the books. The room we had entered was smaller than I'd expected, and there were 8 doors. 3 on the walls to our left and right, and 2 on the wall behind the desk in the middle of the room. There were 2 people at this desk, a male and female elf. The female elf was sitting behind the desk with a serious expression on her face, and the male elf was standing off to the side reading some papers. Ulak and Nash approached the desk, and I followed them with Renv trailing me. "Excuse me, we're here to deliver a missive from High Chief Ulak to Regent Oakmore. Is he in?" Ulak asked politely. "That would be me," the male elf said with a laugh. "What a coincidence. I was just reading up on the situation with the Night Kingdom. May I see the missive?" "Here you are, Your Highness." Ulak passed the letter over. Regent Oakmore took the letter, opened it, and began to read. The woman sitting behind the desk watched the interaction, but was glancing at me every now and then. I smiled at her, and she froze for a moment, but smiled back and politely looked away. As I suspected, strange happenings must be afoot for my blood brother to ask for reinforcements, Oakmore said after a moment. "You know he once fought off one of these invasions single-handedly? Mima, make certain this missive gets to Field General Yom with the instruction that he take his soldiers to Ulamak's aid." "Yes, Your Majesty. Also—" She trailed off and subtly pointed at me. "Oh, the human." Oakmore slid between Ulak and Nash with a speed that would shock lightning. He grabbed my hand and vigorously shook it a few times before saying, "What a pleasure it is to have you visit the mighty kingdom of Bolser. I've been simply dying of curiosity ever since I heard about the orcs discovering you. Ulamak says they found you in a dungeon. Is that right?" Yes, I managed to say despite my shock. "Nash found me and Ulak revived me." "Nash and Ulak?" Oakmore asked. "That would be us, sire," Nash answered, gesturing to himself and Ulak. "Truthfully, why that sly pupper managed to send me the whole set. Tell me, did the situation with the monster in the dungeon ever get resolved? Last I heard, Ulamak was sending over 20s. "It did, Your Highness," Ulak said. "Nick is the one who killed it, actually." "Nick?" Oakmore inquired with confusion before looking back to me. "Oh yes, of course. You must be Nick, then." Yes, sir," I said. "It's simply wonderful to meet you. Please accompany me to my office. I'd like to hear more about your adventures thus far." Nash and Ulak glanced at each other and shrugged slightly. "It would be our pleasure, Your Highness," Ulak said. The human from a dungeon. 38. High Chief Ulamak, adventurer level, not applicable, orc. Kirkenian. "They're in Blurpus?" I asked incredulously. "Not Yerna?" Great Chief Tormund nodded gravely. The greying orc in front of me had ridden night and day to bring me this news himself and beg my aid. Quite a feat for one of his advanced years, but he had done so to make certain that I would not decline his request. He had given of himself to ask me to do the same, and it would be the highest form of disrespect to ignore this. Of course, I had no intention of ignoring or declining his request, but the fact that he rode here himself suggests that he thinks otherwise, which means I need to make it clearer to my great chiefs that I stand with them. Their struggles are my struggles. This line of thought must have shown on my face because Tormund gave me a knowing look. "Ulamak, I rode here myself because my H-Narses are faster than the scouts, and I don't trust anyone but myself and my son with my H-Narses. Since I'm too old for the field, I sent him to lead and came here myself." "Get out of my head," I grinned. "I'll send the regulars and redirect our allies. How's your boy doing?" "He's had better days, I'm sure." Tormund sighed. "Wants to be an artist, not a general. His paintings and sculptures are fine to look at, too. He really cares about his craft. The look on his face when I told him what was required of him was grim. He didn't argue it. No, Grum's a smart boy. He knows that if he doesn't take charge, there's a good chance that many of our people will lose their homes and their lives. He won't allow his aversion to responsibility cause our people to suffer." "I'm glad to hear that. How's things on the front?" "They've captured a settlement and a village. Lofin must have finally sent a competent commander, because they're using shield walls and pikes, and we haven't won a single skirmish. They won't pursue us either, so our traps and tricks have been ineffective. The best we've been able to do is convince them to pull back." The mention of shield walls made the hairs on the back of my neck raise. I had been hoping I was wrong about the vampires, but phalanxes are one of their favored formations. It could be a coincidence, but this, along with the fact that the Drow aren't sticking to any of their patterns, is alarming. Tormund noted my silence and thoughtful expression. You don't think? His eyes went wide as he trailed off. It can't be the vampires, can it? How could they have infiltrated Lofin's inner circle? Tormund is old enough that he was raised on stories of his father fighting against the vampires of the Night Kingdom. He had even personally led the charge against the remnants that threatened our borders. Of all the great chiefs, he was uniquely qualified to know how dire a threat the vampires can be. I don't know, but it's not outside the realm of possibility, I said. Lofin's paranoid, but he's also an idiot. His criteria for choosing his generals is well known, and it wouldn't be hard to take advantage of that. But how can this be? Drow can't be turned, and there isn't a single non-Drow noble in the entirety of the Night Kingdom. Lofin's not stupid enough to make a vampire his general, right? I don't have answers. It could be that the Drow in question is simply working with the vampires, or it could be that Lofin couldn't find a general among his nobility and hired a mercenary. Regardless, something is definitely off about this invasion. Have there been any reports of vampires in the field? No, none at all. There's that at least, I said as I rubbed my chin, so either I'm wrong about my hunch that the vampires are at work here, or Lofin is unaware of the vampiric influence on this invasion. What if he's dead? Tormund asked. Can't be. One, I'd have heard about it. Lofin doesn't pay his staff well enough to keep their silence. Two, there's a functional Drow army. The nobility of the Night Kingdom wouldn't be able to pull that off without Lofin. Those strings are too fragile for the vampires to be able to yank them. It's a mystery, Tormund sighed and leaned back in his chair. Still, doesn't change what must be done. Blurpus must be defended. What are we going to do about the shields? Shields won't help them if they attack your keep. But for the field, we may want to look into mounted mages, I suggested, or axes. Axes would probably be cheaper. They're using pikes and spears. The axes have trouble closing in. I like the idea of a mage cavalry, though. Yeah, but we don't really have the infrastructure for that sort of thing. The guilds might. They've got to know of some adventurers that can use magic and ride a hnasa. Sure, but it's going to be costly. Won't be a long-term solution to this kind of combat. Can't expect this to be a quick war. Tormund laughed. You should use that overly large head of yours to find a way to encourage mages to join the regulars. Then we wouldn't have to worry about this kind of thing. My head isn't overly large, old one. Yours is just small, I grinned. Then a thought occurred to me. Magic users like to study and learn. It helps them with their casting. Maybe a school or something. Charge tuition and offer waivers for military service. The guilds would probably have an interest in that. Might even be willing to pay extra taxes to help fund it. See? Big head, big ideas. Regent, I shouted, ignoring the jab from Tormund. Regent quickly popped his head through my door. Yes, High Chief? I need a meeting with the leaders of the adventurers' guilds and companies. If they want to continue operating in the unified chiefdoms, they'd better get here with speed. Regent nodded and closed the door. Tormund raised an eyebrow at me, then grinned. You'd ban them? He asked. Damn right, I replied. Most of them are tax dodgers anyway. All I've got to do is send the auditors and they're done. They're well aware of that. Tormund nodded and chuckled. The truth is, most of the guild leaders are respectful and will come when called regardless of whether or not I make threats. While it's true that the majority of them definitely do not pay their legally obligated share of taxes, they still understand their place in the world. A handful of them, though, do not. They keep forgetting that their wealth does not equate to status here in the unified chiefdoms, and in Kirkena especially. If I didn't threaten them, they would ignore me. This would force me to do some rather unsavory things to teach whoever replaces them not to repeat their mistakes. My father once told me that if I could avoid being cruel, then I should do so at all costs. Fear naturally follows respect, but respect does not follow fear. He generally knew what he was talking about in regards to governing, so it's advice that I heed. A school for magic, Tormund said thoughtfully. How long do you suppose it'll take to make? That depends almost entirely upon the mages, I replied. We've got some empty buildings that would do the trick. The Uli Trade Union building is what I'm thinking. The Uli finally gave up the ghost. Thought I'd never see the day. Yeah, they've been done for a while now. Thankfully, it was a slow decline, so it didn't hurt the economy too much when the boys shut the doors. The Uli Trade Union had been a multinational trade organization that began a long time ago. My great-grandfather had given the seal of approval for the construction of their gigantic office. A series of scandals and bad business decisions had started their decline during my father's time, and I had signed the paperwork that forgave their debts and closed their doors. What are the Uli boys up to these days? I don't know. Part of their debt forgiveness was the requirement that they forfeit their property and leave the chiefdom. They didn't tell me where they planned to go. Tormund slapped his knees. So one more thing before I go. You met with the thing that they dragged out of that dungeon. Sure did, I grinned. He's a human. A human? What's that? Well, looks kind of like an elf, but with round ears and a few sharp teeth. Didn't really get a chance to talk to him very much because I had him deliver a missive to Bolser to request aid against the Drow. The reports say he's from another world, and that world is full of humans like him. Oh, and he can eat meat and veg. Weird, Tormund frowned. You sent him to Bolser by himself? He that strong? Guild says he's level 7 already, but no, I sent him along with Fleshcarver Yilda's boys, Nash and Ulak. She adopted the human, you know. No shit, Tormund laughed. Haven't heard from Yilda Alta in decades. Any word on how she's doing? From the sound of things, she's enjoying the quiet life. Can't begrudge her that, not after what she gave for it. Too true. So the human. Think he's dangerous? Probably, but not to us. He seems pretty amicable and level-headed. That's good to hear, Tormund said as he rose from his chair. So long as you've got some idea as to what you're doing with the human, I'm fine with whatever you decide. I should get back. I nodded solemnly as he turned to leave my office. He paused for a moment at the door. Should I accompany you? I asked, trying to guess the reason for his hesitation. He turned to look at me with a little bit of shock. I suppose I had guessed wrong, and it hadn't even occurred to him to ask. My prowess on the battlefield is well known, and even though Tormund and the rest of the great chiefs are big orcs, I tower over them. Tormund met my eyes and then looked at the mountains of paperwork on my desk. I don't think so, Ulak, he answered with a grin. Things are not quite so dire as to give you an excuse to get away from the paperwork. But there's just so much of it, though, I said with an exaggerated frown. Tormund and I laughed for a few moments before things settled down into a somber silence. When you enter the field of battle, it will be indicative of failure on our part, Tormund said. We'll do everything in our power to ensure you get to enjoy your paperwork. Goodbye, High Chief. Goodbye, Great Chief. Tormund left the room, and I sighed. I'd known Tormund since I was a child, and it pained me to see him as an elder now. The massive orc that had sparred with me and shocked me with his speed and power was now too old to even accompany his son into battle. Still, I felt a little beam of pride that he liked my idea for a magic school. Maybe we could do more than one and have the schools compete with each other to further motivate their students. No, I doubt there'll be any need for that. The knowledge of magic alone will be more than enough motivation for most of the students. Hell, maybe once things get going, I'll take a class or two. Find out if I could have been good at magic or not. My gaze fell back to my paperwork. Fuck, I whispered to myself as I picked up my pen. A knock on my office door saved me from the looming task at hand. Regent poked his head into my office. Hi, Chief, 2 of the guild leaders are here to see you, he said. Which ones? I asked. Pumos and the Adventurers Guild. Send them in, no need for introductions. Regent nodded and left the room. The Adventurers Guild and the Pumos Union were the 2 largest guilds in the unified chiefdoms. The Adventurers Guild was much larger than the Pumos Union, though, because their operation is multinational. Even so, the Pumos Union was no pushover and even offered mercenary services that the AG didn't typically bother with. There are a lot of areas in the UC that wouldn't have any sort of police if it weren't for Pumos. And the easiest way to become a guard is to join up with them. A gnome and an elf entered my office and bowed. The gnome is Malura Grinzar, and she is the head of the Pumos Union. The elf is Yaraway Horfu, and he is the master of the Adventurers Guild. I gestured for them to take a seat, and they happily complied. There are two things we need to discuss, I said once they were settled. They subtly glanced at each other. I could imagine what they might think this meeting is about, and how nervous they both were. I had to fight a grin. First is the situation with the Night Kingdom invasion. I need mages that know how to ride a hnass while casting. They will be pressed into service for the remainder of the invasion, but they will be well compensated for their efforts. Eyes widened and eyebrows shot up. It had been decades since adventurers had been drafted, and my willingness to impose upon their freedoms indicated a dire situation. Malura opened her mouth to say something, but quickly closed it again. "It will be done, High Chief," Yaraway said. "So the rumors are true, then?" "I don't know what the rumors are, so I cannot say," I replied. "What I can say is that the Drow are using tactics that we are ill-prepared to respond to, and they invaded Blurpus instead of Yerna. We are planning on utilizing a mage cavalry force to tip things in our favor." "Mounted mages, I'll be damned," Malura said. "The second thing we need to discuss is the possibility of a school for study of magic. It will be an academic institution dedicated to instructing mages on the magical arts, both to further the common knowledge of magic as well as to bolster the caliber of our mages. Funding will be done through a mixture of government subsidies and tuition, with tuition waivers offered for completion of military service." The two guild leaders maintained their shocked expressions. Whatever they had thought this meeting to be about, I was demolishing their expectations. Malura recovered first this time. "How can we help, High Chief?" she asked. "I need teachers and administrators that are well-versed in magic. It is unclear how many we will need as of yet, so I want you to make a list of those who are qualified and who may be interested." "You said government subsidy, High Chief? How will the chiefdom be getting the funds necessary to start this Academy of Magic?" Yaraway asked. "Oh, that's quite simple," I said as a malicious grin spread across my features. "I'll just be needing you to pay a bit more of your fair share of taxes. Some estimates put your payments at around 30% of what you should actually be paying. If you bump that up to 40%, we'll be able to afford the academy, and I won't have to send the auditors." Their stunned silence was music to my ears. Chapter 39. Nick Smith, Adventurer Level 7, Human American. "Instead of my office, let us use one of these conference rooms. They're much nicer and have more chairs," Regent Oakmore said as we walked. "Sounds great, Your Highness," Nash replied. We walked a little further before the Regent halted and gestured to a closed door. I awkwardly froze, trying to figure out what he wanted, but Ulak stepped past me and opened the door. Oakmore caught my confusion, gave me a slight smile, and nodded warmly to Ulak before entering the room. I guess maybe royalty doesn't open doors for other people. I worked my way through my confusion as we entered the room. My jaw nearly dropped. Oakmore had described it as a conference room, but that hardly did it justice. The room was luxuriously large, and its stone walls were covered in various banners, one of which I had seen while in Kirkina. There were various other decorations spread throughout the room, like swords, maces, and a hand from a large clawed monster. In the center of the room was a massive wooden table with intricate engravings that were inlaid with gold. The chairs surrounding the table matched its engravings, but had cushions on their seats, arms, and backs. Their backs were extra tall and reminded me of the expensive reclining chairs that influencers peddled for ridiculous amounts of money back home. I was wondering if they could recline when Oakmore sat and gestured to the chairs across from him. "Please, sit down. We have much to discuss," he said with another small smile. We sat with Ulak to my left and Nash to my right. Renv sat next to Nash and sighed contently. The chairs were remarkably comfortable, and I had to fight the urge to melt into their cushions. It's the first cushioned chair I've sat in since coming to this world. When I get back home, I'm never taking cushioned seats for granted again. Oakmore began by verifying the information he'd been given thus far. "Yes, I am from another world. I do in fact need to eat both plants and meat. Yilda Alta adopted me into the Alta clan." No, I wasn't technically the one who killed the thing in the dungeon. We came here to deliver the missive and to see if we could get some rubbings translated. Yes, I am desperately trying to get back home, and I miss my family terribly. Well, on that note, are you planning on seeing our true king? Regent Oakmore asked with an eager grin. Actually, Your Majesty, Ulak began. Yes, we are, I interrupted, surprised at the firmness in my voice. Your king is a dragon, right? I asked the follow-up question to put Ulak into a difficult position. To argue with me, he would have to interrupt the regent. I don't know a lot about monarchy or regency, but I do know that he's been calling Oakmore Your Majesty. And it's usually a bad idea to interrupt someone who requires that honorific. Not just any dragon, Oakmore said, beaming with pride. A high dragon. A normal dragon is fearsome and respectable, one of the most terrible and deadly beasts to ever exist. But it is just a beast. They have intelligence and motivations comparable to puppers or schnarses. High dragons are much smarter and deadlier than their less evolved cousins. What do you mean? I asked. I dared a glance at Ulak, who was staring at me. His expression betrayed confusion rather than anger, though. I felt a stab of guilt as I realized he was trying to figure out why I had interrupted him and changed our plans on the fly instead of feeling angry at me for doing so. I didn't bother looking at Nash, though. I can feel the venom in his gaze. High dragons are near divinity when it comes to their intelligence. The legends tell of high dragon elders accurately predicting the outcomes of battles years before they were fought. While that may be an exaggeration, the high dragons were instrumental in driving the demons and Eniels out of our world. Oakmore's tone took a sad turn. A lot of them died to do that, though, including the parents of our true king. He avenged them in a glorious battle that lasted for 3 weeks and returned to Bolser for his coronation. I'm not sure what happened during that battle, but he promptly issued a declaration of regency and fell into a slumber that has lasted ever since. A declaration of regency? Yes. The declaration of regency governs the requirements for my office. Essentially, I act as king in his absence. When I die, there will be an election and a new regent will be chosen. Who chooses the new regent? The people of the land, of course. I paused for a moment. A democratic monarchy sounds alien to me. But on the other hand, I don't really know much about kings and queens. Rather than exposing my ignorance, I opted to ask something else. High Chief Ulak says you're his blood brother. How did that happen? I asked. Ulak and I adventured together in our youth. We have saved each other's lives on multiple occasions, and when it came time for him to take over the post of High Chief, we decided to take a blood oath, the elf answered. At the time, the intention was for me to come to his aid as an adventurer whenever he needed it. Then my father passed, and I was pressured into running for regent, namely because no one else wanted to. Now our blood oath requires the both of us to come to each other's aid for as long as we rule. So until you die? Or, wait, what happens to you if the High Dragon wakes up? I asked. I will resign my post as regent and take up whatever duty our king offers me, the elf smiled, or I just retire. I have enough savings to last me for the rest of my life and make sure my children get a good inheritance. Retire? You wouldn't go back to adventuring? Oh, I'm far too old for that sort of thing, Oakmore waved his hand dismissively. Really? You don't look all that old? Oakmore began laughing, and all 3 of my companions chuckled along with him. I looked around with a confused expression, seeking an answer until it finally hit me. Even back home, elves don't age all that much. Damn it. Elves do not typically demonstrate our age upon our faces, Oakmore explained as he wiped a tear. Apologies for my outburst. Your question was simply unexpected. I likely have a couple of decades left until I'm infirm, but my adventuring days are well behind me. What level did you manage to get to, Your Majesty? Nash asked. I rose to level 62, thanks mostly to Ulak. He could probably return to adventuring if the situation arose. Really? Ulak asked. I thought he was older than you, Your Highness. He is, but he's also of royal lineage, Oakmore answered, before frowning slightly. Ah, but I digress. I am fairly certain that the details of the royal lineage are secret. So if you wish to learn more, you will have to ask him directly. Ulak nodded and retreated into his thoughts, rubbing his chin to process what he'd heard. Nash furrowed his brows and crossed his arms, also an indication that he was thinking. Renv and I simply looked at the two orcs, confused by their reactions. Now, Nick, I cannot help but notice that you have been omitting my honorific this entire time, Oakmore said with a sly grin. I have chosen not to take this as an insult, but I cannot help but wonder why. Apologies, Your Highness, I said rapidly. I've never met a regent before, and we didn't have royalty or nobility where I'm from. Truly, he asked as his eyebrows rose, absolutely remarkable. How are your people governed? I explained the various types of government in the United States to Regent A. Oakmore to the best of my ability, which inevitably led to more questions about my world. Thankfully, Oakmore seemed more interested in our various forms of entertainment and food than our other technology, so I was able to easily avoid the subject of weapons. In this world, adventurers hold the majority of the combat abilities. They have to train those abilities and hone them to be able to cause massive amounts of destruction. Guns and nukes would change that power dynamic very quickly, and even pointing out the possibility of their existence may eventually lead to someone creating them. Can't be too careful. You can look at cute pets while communicating with anyone in the world almost instantaneously. Oakmore leaned back in his chair. Marvelous. Simply marvelous. I know it's unlikely to ever happen, but I can't help but wish to see such wonders with my own eyes. Fucking hells, me too, Renv said. I glanced at Renv and realized that everyone else had followed suit. Nash and Ulak looked shocked, and Regent Oakmore raised his left eyebrow. The already diminutive dwarf shrank even further at our various gazes. My apologies, Your Majesty, he stammered. I didn't mean to swear in your presence. It won't happen again, Your Highness. See that it doesn't, though your reaction is more than understandable. Oakmore straightened. Well, my curiosity is sated for now. Please allow me to accompany you to our true king. Watching His Royal Majesty's slumber may sound dull, but there truly is nothing quite like it. The regent rose from his chair, and we followed suit. He led us back to where we had entered the building and whispered something to the woman at the front desk. Her green eyes narrowed at Oakmore with disapproval, but she didn't say anything. He grinned at her and gestured for us to follow him. When we left the building, he took a deep breath. Ah, fresh air. It's been so long, he chuckled. So do any of you know why our streets are wider than that of other kingdoms? So that your king can walk through the kingdom when he awakens, Your Majesty, Ulak asked. Correct. You are a bright one. When His Royal Highness first entered his slumber, he did so in a sparsely populated portion of the kingdom, not wanting to get in the way of our growth. However, his subjects love him so much that many of them moved here, and everything was built around him to make sure that he would be comfortable when he awoke. We've even cleared the airspace in case he needs to fly. How many people live here, Your Majesty? I asked. Our last census has us at 11,000, with a margin of error of 1%. This is the most densely populated portion of Bolser, and if we had cities, it would likely be our capital. Oh, and don't fret over my honorific, Nick. I understand now that your culture is vastly different from ours, and I'm willing to treat you as a sort of diplomat. Thank you, sir. Your Highness, I didn't see any fortifications as we approached. Why is that? Nash asked. Just because you didn't see our fortifications doesn't mean they aren't there, Oakmore winked, which would be more effective at routing an invading army. A simple stone wall or arrows and spells coming from all around you at impossible angles. Nash's eyes widened and he fell into a contemplative silence. We are not invaded often either, Oakmore continued. Our only two neighbors are the Night Kingdom and the Unified Chiefdoms. The Unified Chiefdoms meet us at the south and west, and the Night Kingdom meets us at the north and west. It's just ocean on the east. Since the Unified Chiefdoms are friendly with us, our only threat is the Night Kingdom. They've tried invading us before, but they rarely make it past the Fae with anything resembling an invasion force. The Fae fight them, I asked. Some do. Most prefer trickery and subterfuge, but those that take pleasure in direct action are quite brutal. The Blood and Bone Fae especially. Blood and Bone Fae? Do those live in the deep wild forest? Odd of you to ask that. Oakmore studied me for a moment. No, both the blood and the bone fae tend to live along our northern border, in a place the fae call Grimstar's Wood. They have been known to migrate somewhat, but never so far as the deep wild forest. How are you aware of the fae living there? I explained our encounter with Tits and Algebron as we continued our walk. The Regent waited patiently as I explained their attempt to trick us into giving them our names, and his eyebrows rose as I told him that I named them. He stopped dead in his tracks when I told him that they'd turned into archfey, and the rest of us quickly followed suit. They became archfey? He asked. Yes, Your Majesty, I stammered, caught completely off guard by his sudden seriousness. You made them into archfey? I suppose so, sir. Oakmore leaned toward me and studied me carefully. I tried not to lean away, but his piercing gaze forced my instincts to kick in. After a few moments of intense scrutiny, the Regent resumed his former posture and began to laugh. Oh, by the gods, he said as he recovered. That's going to anger someone powerful, I'm sure. No matter, that's a problem for another time. Let's continue on, shall we? He gestured for us to follow as he began to walk once more. The four of us looked at each other and quickly trailed after the Regent. Who would get mad? I asked. The Fey Chroniclers for sure, but you don't have to worry about them. The only one you might have to worry about is Mummeldobran, but he's likely to be more angry at the new Archfey than at you. He glanced at me and caught the concern on my face. Oh, don't worry about them. Mummeldobran will probably just give them an earful and a hard time for a few years. I was about to ask what he knew about Mummeldobran when a certain smell caught my attention, the musky scent of reptile with a hint of rotten eggs. No, that's sulfur. I looked around for the source of the smell, but it became obvious as we turned a corner. The high dragon looked exactly like what I have seen in video games. It was resting on a platform with stairs, curled up with its front legs supporting the base of its neck and its head resting on its tail. I could barely make out the claws of its hind legs poking out from underneath its wings. Shining white scales covered its body, glimmering in a massive sunbeam, the first I'd seen so far. The only thing that was missing was a treasure hoard underneath it. This is our true king. Oakmore took a few steps and gestured dramatically. Isinerath, king of Bolser and bane of the horde. My eyes remained on the high dragon as I followed the Regent. Its body slow expanded and deflated slightly as it breathed, causing a sort of shimmering effect from its scales. It was bigger than an elephant, but breathtakingly beautiful. I looked at its face and noticed that its eyes were moving under their lids, like it was dreaming. I was trying to imagine what it was dreaming about when the movement stopped. Everything in my body told me that it was awake and watching me. I felt the blood drain from my face and froze in my tracks. Oakmore and my companions turned to look at me, confused at my sudden halt. The dragon's eyes snapped open, looking directly into my own. Chapter 40. Isinerath, adventurer level, not applicable, high dragon, unknown. Yes, get that out of your mouth. Yemshmover, I tried to reply as I spit the befuddled troll back onto the ground. You know better than to eat trolls without cooking them first, boy, my father scolded me. Yes, father. Really now, they are quite filthy. Go wash your mouth out, mother said. The troll looked at my parents and then back at me with confusion. It could not understand what we were saying and looked confused at being spared. It sat there nonplussed as if it were the one being scolded. I dismissively waved a claw at it, which released it from whatever stuporous spell was holding its poor little mind. It rose and began to run, and I walked over to the river to obey my mother's command. A shame that my parents caught me. Actually, how did they catch me? They were arguing. They couldn't have been paying attention to me. Never mind, it doesn't matter. Trolls are delicious. They have chewy, juicy muscles with plenty of succulent fat, which makes for a rather perfect mouthful of meat. The bones add a magnificent crunch too. My parents are correct that trolls are filthy little creatures, but I've never minded the grime. It's just seasoning, really. I dipped my head in the river and drew water into my mouth. It was cool and refreshing, and it took more than a little willpower to spit my first mouthful back into the river. I took in some more, swished it around, gargled, and spat once more. Once my mouth was sufficiently rinsed, I gulped down gallons of the fresh water, along with a few inattentive fish. Then I laid on my back and my wings on the rocks as I watched my parents talk. "You can't be serious, Sura Navarro. The demons have nearly wiped out the elves. What good would it do for us to help them now, of all times?" my mother asked. A strange smell nearly distracted me, but I wanted to hear my father's response. My father is wise, but he has a blind spot in his wisdom in regards to demons. He hates them more than I have ever seen anyone hate anything, and mother is right to worry for his logic. "Don't cry my name wantonly, Esramil. There is no need for such disrespect," my father replied with a flick of his tongue. "While it is true that the elves have taken severe casualties, they are not extinct yet. The threat of their extinction is imminent, though, which means they will be all the more grateful for our aid. They'll have no issues submitting to our rule, and we can finally merge our two kingdoms into one." He's talking about Bolser and Yivanita. Bolser is our kingdom, and Yivanita is the independent elven kingdom. In ages past, the elves managed to convince one of my ancestors to allow them to self-govern. Recently, it was occupied by the demons before being liberated by the Aniels. Once the elves rebelled against the Aniels, the demons quickly reoccupied it. The elves have no royalty left, and very little in the way of nobility. My father has made an excellent point. At the moment, Bolser is strong. The demons and the Aniels have left us alone, with the exception of their skirmishes spilling into our land. Yivanita is ravaged. But if it were to combine with Bolser, we would be able to help the elves rebuild their homes and businesses in record time. And if we don't, it won't be long before the demons have eradicated the elves and turned their attentions to us. That damned smell again. Where is it? I looked around, but there was not a single clue to its origin. It smelled familiar, but also hauntingly alien. It was comforting, disturbing, lovely, and threatening all at once. It's a smell that I feel I should remember from somewhere, but have never encountered before. Or have I? Unable to find its origin, I turned back to my parents. "Bah, they are short-minded like the rest of them are," my mother said with a dismissive wave of her claw. "They'll be grateful to us this generation and perhaps the next. But by the third generation, they will demand freedom to once again create their illusory territories. We'll barely be better off. It's not worth the risk of fighting the demons." "My dear, the elves that live under our rule are happy. The elves of Yivanita will see this and be happy as well. Only those who are mistreated desire independence, and we will certainly be a better option than those damnable demons." I looked to the sky in contemplation. The demons. I'd eaten a demon once. It tasted terrible and took forever to digest. Wait, that's wrong. It is taking forever to digest. Oh right, this is a dream. Mother and father are long dead, and not even their bones remain. The demons had made certain of that. I looked back to my parents, and indeed they were gone. My father had eventually talked my mother into fighting the demons, and I had helped. They were both slain during the conflict, and I had lost myself in rage and grief. My wrath was unstoppable, and the demon lord that had taken their lives is currently being dissolved in my stomach. I then became king of Bolser and merged Yivanita into my domain with no argument from the elves. I have been napping among them ever since, leaving them to their own devices. That damned smell again. I awoke, being careful to keep my eyes closed. The demon in my belly made me tired, like I'd always just eaten a rather large lunch. A benefit to this is that my nutritional needs are constantly fulfilled. But the downside is that it's difficult to concentrate on ruling while I'm in such a state. My solution to this was simple. I decided to name a regent and sleep until I got hungry again. However, sleeping indefinitely is impossible, and every time I awoke, the elves would lose their minds with glee. They would ask me what they should be doing and how they should go about doing it, and it would take forever to get caught up enough to adequately make those decisions. So I decided to pretend to sleep even when I was awake so that they could go about their business. Before I knew it, though, it had been multiple generations since I'd last spoken to the elves. So many generations that I no longer understood their tongue. It would be terribly awkward if I were to reveal my ruse. This smell has aroused my curiosity, though. Needing to know where it's coming from, I silently cast True Vision and looked through my eyelids. I saw that the elves had redecorated once again. My view of the sky remained unobstructed, though, and I could see that the towering trees had continued to grow during my latest slumber. Judging from how much larger they'd become, it had only been about 80 years since my last stealthy awakening. Those 80 years must have seen quite the economic boom, too. The hill I have been resting on now had stairs with roads leading away from me and winding through the trees. I was impressed that they had managed to do this without waking me. On each side of the roads were buildings that were definitely elven, but reeked of gnomes, dwarves, and orcs. Each building appeared to be specially carved from a tree, but with the obvious advertisements and signs denoting commerce. Shops, perhaps? The elves were none the wiser to my awakening and continued about their business. Some children were being led by an adult, who was speaking in a very condescending tone. Must be a teacher speaking to students. Most of their eyes were wide, which is the proper response to seeing something as gargantuan and graceful as I, but others appeared to be bored. I fought the urge to open my eyes to startle the little cretins. I looked around some more and saw another noteworthy group approaching me. 2 orcs, an elf, a dwarf, and something else. I'd nearly mistaken it for a pig kobold, but it was walking fully upright and seemed to be speaking with the rest of the group. There were 2 other big clues that it wasn't a pig kobold, though. Its ears were round, and it was the thing giving off the intriguing smell. Pork smells like prey, as do kobolds. This doesn't smell like prey. I'm not certain of what it smells like, but it's definitely not prey. I suspect that it would put up as much of a fight as the demon in my belly if I were to try to eat it. Perhaps even more of a fight, considering how injured this particular demon had been by the time I decided to devour it. I turned my eyes toward my stomach. Hergerus the Decimator had been in my belly for over 1,000 years by now. His regeneration abilities had slowed his degradation to a crawl, but there's hardly any meat left on his bones. Even if I were to regurgitate him and allow the regeneration to happen, his mind would never recover fully. The best-case scenario for him would be a complete loss of memory and faculty. Actually, given his reputation, that would be the best-case scenario for everyone. Hergerus had tortured and murdered hundreds of thousands of mer, and the cruelty of his tortures had been more well-known than his near immortality. My advisors at the time had told me that he couldn't be stopped. I fought the urge to smile as I turned my attention back to the group approaching me. It had taken a millennia, but I had finally beat the unbeatable. Hergerus had been known far and wide as the immortal lord of demons, and I used him as sustenance until all that remained of his identity had been destroyed. A fate worthy of such a despicable being. The elf with the group gestured at me, and the smell-bearer suddenly stopped. Its eyes widened in alarm as they made contact with my own. The smell became sharp with fear. It knows. A spark of fear alit my rage when I realized that this being had seen through my ruse. A potential foe, one that could destroy me if it were allowed to grow. My anger caused my breath to quicken, and the smell suddenly became familiar to me. Gods. They were actively watching this thing, and one had even interacted with it. Would they intervene if I were to try to destroy this thing here and now? Or could it be that they interfered with its fate to bring it before me? Is it meant to be an ally or an assassin? There's only one real way to find out what they're planning. I opened my eyes. The creature's skin tone changed from a slight pink to pale white, and I noted with a small measure of satisfaction that the bored children who had been annoying me earlier were now stunned. The creature's comrades were facing it, but the bald orc slowly tracked his gaze back to me. First, his face showed curiosity, then shock. A moment later, everyone except the creature was on their knees. I raised my head to look at it with both eyes. "Why are you still standing, fool?" I asked it. "Do you not know your betters by instinct?" A small measure of confusion managed to peek past the fear that was apparent on its face. I recalled that language had evolved over the years and suddenly felt a pang of self-consciousness. What good is a king that no one can understand? A small smile creeped over the face of the elf that had been guiding the group. "My lord, if I may," he asked. "I doubt that we will get anywhere if you do not," I said, masking my surprise at finding someone who still spoke High Draken. The elf stood, put his hand on the creature's shoulder, and whispered something to it. The creature kneeled so rapidly that I heard its knee hit the ground with what had to be a painful amount of force. My anger subsided at this show of deference, knowing now that it was not arrogance that led to such disrespect. It was either ignorance or fear, both of which can be forgiven. "Your Royal Majesty King Isinirath, I am your humble regent, Visilist Oakmore. May I present to you Nick Smith, Nash Alter, and Ulak Alter," the elf said as he bowed low. "I have just awoke and am in no mood for epithets and magniloquence, Regent," I said. "You will speak plainly. What have you brought before me that reeks of godly plots and interference?" My words caught the regent by surprise. He paused, then looked at the creature. His shock was quickly subdued, however, and he turned back to me. "Your Majesty, this is a human. He is named Nick Smith and was found within a dungeon in a neighboring chiefdom. I know nothing of godly plots and interference, I'm afraid," he said. "You should be," I spat, my anger flaring once again. "One does not become the subject of godly interference ignorantly. Either you are lying to me, or the human is hiding his interactions with gods from you, likely at the behest of said gods." "I will ask him about it, sire." I made a circular motion with my claw to indicate that the regent should be quick with his questions. The human was hesitant to speak, but after a moment there was discussion between the two. The orc with braids appeared confused, but the bald one gave the impression that he had been granted clarification. The dwarf looked lost and alarmed during the entire conversation. The regent asked several questions, and once the discussion was over, he explained to me what he had learned. The human had been caught in an explosion caused by bandits and lost consciousness when he used all his magic to heal his friend. This was when he had met a being that said it was occasionally called a god. I nodded as he explained that the god wanted the human to appear before me, and that I would put him on the path to returning to his world. This piqued my interest. Not only had the god encouraged this human to appear before me, likely knowing that my curiosity would get the better of me, but it had also presumed that I would be willing to help the human in some capacity. I examined it closely, using various vision magics for a complete investigation. Everything about him is strange. The first thing I noticed is that his magic core is completely artificial, and contains much more magic than a mortal's magic core should. Its channels are extremely efficient and lack any sort of subtlety as well. A sorcerer's magical capabilities were often impacted by how efficient these channels are, and as such, the human is likely capable of terrible acts of magic. The next thing I noted is the amount of metal within its body. Within its skull is an object that seems to interface directly with each part of its brain. Floating through its blood, lymph, and bile are extremely small chunks of metal that seem to be moving of their own volition. After examining them closely, I realized that they are extremely small machines performing various tasks. Unlike most machines I had seen before, these are not made of iron or steel, but various precious metals for reasons undeterminable. The final thing I determined is how different its anatomy and physiology appear to be from the mortals of this world. Some organs are shared with the orcs, others are shared with the elves and dwarves. Some have different compositions, but seem to perform similar functions. Others are completely unique to the human and serve functions that are nearly unnoticeable. There is also evidence of massive amounts of surgery, but someone had managed to minimize this evidence. "It certainly appears to be otherworldly," I told the regent. "I do not know how I would go about aiding his return to his world, though. Nor am I inclined to try, given the circumstances regarding this request." "I must beg your forgiveness and mercy, my liege." The elf placed his forehead upon the ground. "The circumstances behind this boy's presence in our realm are tragic, and it would pain me dearly to see his quest unfulfilled. I dare not pretend to know the motives or missions of the gods, nor do I presume to begin to imagine the reasons behind your disdain for them. But I cannot help but beg your grace, sire." "You dare beg my grace with the very same epithets and magniloquence that I told you to abandon mere moments ago, boy?" I demanded with a low growl. I'm sorry, he replied. This just isn't how I imagined this would go. Memories of the elves of old bringing me gifts and gratitude for saving them from the demons flooded back to me. They were ecstatic whenever I would awaken from my slumber and even host feasts to celebrate. A small stab of guilt pierced the iciness in my heart as I realized that even after several generations had passed, my people still love me. Very well, I sighed, explain the human circumstances to me. Regent Oakmore elaborated the reasons behind his feelings, sparing no amount of drama in his retelling. A boy stolen away from his ailing love and transported to a strange world where he obviously does not belong, with no recollection of his relocation or knowledge of how to return. Despite the regent's garish bardic skills, I managed to feel some empathy for the human. I had been a youngling when Bolser went to war against the demons, and my world changed forever. I remember how lost I felt when my daily decisions went from mundane to grave in the blink of an eye. I had my parents to guide me through this transition, though. The human does not. I will consider it. How would my assistance be applied? I asked. Before Oakmore could answer, something unexpected happened. Excuse me, Your Majesty, Nick said. Can you understand me now?